Everybody, today's Wednesday, March 21st. This is the City Council Rail Committee meeting, a special meeting. It's 8:09 a.m. And since our chair is not here, we're just going to kick it off. Could we please take the roll?
Councilmember Fine.
Here.
Councilmember Koo. Here. Councilmember Scharf.
Here.
Chair Wolbach. 3 present.
Thank you very much. Do we have any oral communications for items not on the agenda?
Yes, right.
All right. Since we've got a lot of folks, I'm going to do 2 minutes each. It looks like we have 6 or 7 here. First speaker is Stephen Rosenblum. Good morning.
Good morning, members of the Rail Committee. My name is Stephen Rosenblum. I live on Santa Rita Avenue. I wanted to comment today about the financial part of the rail grade separation. It's the second most important criterion after deciding on the preferred configuration. In spite of the fact that financing white paper produced by our consultants, Economic and Planning Systems Incorporated, was presented to the Rail Committee at the meeting on November 29th, 2017, it has not yet been discussed by the committee. As an example regarding value capture on page 8 of the white paper, I question the first line, claiming that the city could only expect a maximum of $235 million from 2,000 housing units and 750,000 square feet of commercial development, when fixer-upper starter homes now cost upwards of $1 million. The citizens of Palo Alto deserve to hear an open discussion of these numbers in order to understand what the full panoply of funding options are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Dave Shen, and for the record, our Chair Wolbach has just arrived. Welcome.
Distinguished Rail Committee members, first I would like to thank the various committee members for hearing the concerns of those living in and around the Churchill-Alma intersection and working with us on possible solutions to our intersection. I present to you the latest petition with now 205 signatures for our preferences, and we envision support to grow even larger in the coming weeks. Next, I'd like to show this postcard, which I received in the mail a few weeks back. This is a notice of director's hearing. My neighbor has a construction project in an adjacent yard, and I get a notification from the city. However, when there's a city project which could result in the seizure of my home, like the rail project, I get nothing. So may I say that the communication priorities here are more than a little bit skewed and wrongly defined? We continually find people have no idea that this rail project is even going on. I would urge the community to take steps to increase information outflow to the community. We are doing well in our efforts, but they would pale in comparison to an official notice of a meeting held by the city to educate and inform the community. To me, they don't have to be roundtables. You just need to do a meeting to present what is going on, take some questions, and that's it. Forget the feedback tables. It's unreasonable to ask people who are encountering the information for the first time to answer rail preference questions accurately when they need more time to reflect on what they have heard. Last, I had a question regarding the options that we'll be discussing today. We had been advocating for, which are improvements at Embarcadero and pedestrian cyclist underpass at Churchill together. I see the Embarcadero improvements as a separate option, but no mention of any pedestrian cyclist underpass at Churchill, and just would like to know why that was. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Roland LeBrun, to be followed by Nadia Nayash.
Good morning, and now for something entirely different. I don't know if you either read the press or had the opportunity of reviewing the new High-Speed Rail Authority's business plan, but what is of interest to us is that they're essentially proposing to extend Caltrain electrification to Gilroy. Now, if that happens, the geographical center of the line is going to shift south by 10 to 15th mile. So what I would suggest to you is to reach out to the JPB and offer your council chambers for future Caltrain board meetings as this matter develops. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, Nadia Nayak, to be followed by Stephen Rosenblum.
Good morning.
Nope, that's on to the next item. Nadia Nayak is our last speaker on this item.
Good morning. I just wanted to make a comment, as you have all received my lengthy comments already. When going through the website and I was sort of looking for things, I can't find all of the public comments that get submitted to the Rail Committee. They're not becoming attachments to the agenda packets. You can't find them at the subsequent meeting. I don't know if it's because if communication goes just to the rail committee, is it found in an all city council packet, and maybe that's where I need to be directed. But if I'm used to looking on the website and I can't find stuff, that means that probably the average person really can't find stuff. And so if there's a way where we could update that, either putting it with each meeting that it goes to or sticking it on the Connections Palo Alto page, I just think it would be helpful, specifically in thinking about the funding and financing paper that Steve mentioned. If we got any feedback on it, it's not visible anywhere to the public. And so later in my comments, when I talk about the fact that I don't know if we're applying it correctly, I can't see what anyone has turned in to know what ideas were brought forward. And I would just say that that makes it difficult to participate as a public person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to action item number 1, report on the March 6th, 2018 Community Roundtable meeting on the Trench and Tunnel Grade Separation White Paper. Staff, who would like to take the lead?
I will, Chair Wolbach, Rob DeGo, City Manager's Office, and had the opportunity to help with the facilitation of the March 6th Roundtable on Trench and Tunnel. It ran from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at the Arts Center. The objectives of that meeting was really largely to create awareness of the recent trench and tunnel white paper that was shared. Oh, it's on. Maybe I need to be closer. Okay, there you go. Purpose of the roundtable was largely to create awareness of the new information that we have, the trench and tunnel white paper. We also wanted to share some perspectives, both staff perspectives on the trench and tunnel options, and also we had guest speaker Mark Christoffels, Chief Executive Officer and Chief Engineer of the Alameda Corridor East Construction Authority, who built a large construction project, a rail project that included a trench, and these were shared, of course, with this rail committee as well. And then the second half of the meeting was about listening to the public, getting their ideas, their concerns, and interests, and that was through roundtable discussion. We had very large attendance, over 200 attendees, so standing room only at certain points. A real mix of folks that were there, some people that were sort of brand new to the topic, some that were somewhat informed, and of course we had those that are very informed and are attending all meetings. We heard a little bit of everything, as happens at these meetings. There were lots of questions, a thirst for more information. I think there's a real eagerness for the screening process to begin, which is timely because we're going to be doing that this morning. Community members seem to really want to compare ideas and narrow the field of options and get more information about the fewer viable ideas that are out there. A recurring concern that we heard were potential property impacts in eminent domain. I think that was probably the primary concern that I heard. Also, even though this roundtable was about trench and tunnel white paper, citizens naturally wanted to talk about their fears or interests, whatever they may be. So there was lots of discussion beyond trench and tunneling. Some folks wanting to talk about elevating the train and that should be back on the table. Others saying that should be off the table for a variety of reasons. We also heard from several members that were there and tables that were there to close Churchill. This idea from the North Old Palo Alto Neighborhood Association seems to be getting some traction to close that crossing and build a bike and pedestrian underpass and improve the Embarcadero circulation and flow. So specifically to the trench and tunnel options, the deep bore to the tunnel, clearly this remains of interest to the community. Not everyone felt that way, but definitely there's some considerable sort of hope that is actually a viable option. The sort of lower construction impacts, reduced noise with the train underground, recapturing land above the tunnel makes this sort of naturally, I think, appealing. What we tried to do was ask members of the community that were there to really think through how we would overcome the significant constructability challenges of actually making that happen, and they include the estimated cost of $3+ billion. The necessary approvals from adjacent cities, which would be very difficult. The need to get Caltrain to approve a different grade above 1%, as well as the ongoing and significant operating and maintenance costs that would have to be borne by the city. So ideas that we heard to address these challenges include monetizing the land above a tunnel. Hopes for, and I say hopes, I don't mean to say that in a critical way, but it came across more, I think, hopes that the state and federal government would help fund a tunnel, or hopes that that the business community of Stanford would come forward and help fund a tunnel or something like that. There was interest in creating a multi-joint powers authority for a more coordinated approach to grade separation across the region. And many other ideas and thoughts, and you can see that in the packet, and we included all the comments that were written down on different tables. So that was the tunnel option. On the citywide trench, it definitely seemed to be less interest in a citywide trench for a variety of reasons. It seemed the costs and the construction impacts in particular just seemed too high, significant concerns about the shoe fly and the impacts to Alma Street for long periods of time, and particularly concerned about emergency vehicles during, a long period of construction like that, and the dangers that would cause. Again, there was a variety of opinions. It's very difficult to get any kind of consensus at a meeting like this. Finally, on the trench, the sort of a partial trench was discussed by many members of the community, and that did seem to have more interest, and people wanted to explore that further, particularly in South Palo Alto, East Meadow, Charleston crossings, being that their proximity is very close. The cost is significantly less than any kind of citywide option, and this option does actually allow us not to take property, or hopefully would take less property than some of the other options that could be considered at those two crossings. So that definitely seemed to be of interest to the public. So we're continuing to review the feedback that we've received, and certainly got a lot of questions. We're adding the questions and the answers that we have to the Connecting Palo Alto FAQ. And Jim was there, and Josh was there, and Hillary, and we were all there, so we all probably had a little bit of different perspective. I think Chair Walbach was there for a while, and some other council members. So, but that's my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Info only. We do have a couple of public speakers for this item. Stephen Rosenblum, to be followed by Martin Bernstein.
So I just wanted to make a few comments about this report on the roundtable and the roundtable itself. With regard to the roundtable format, there were not enough staff available to have one present at each table, so questions could not be addressed in a timely fashion. Secondly, I disagree with the choice of Mark Christoffel as a presenter on a trenching project, since the project he described dealt with a heavy rail 3-track freight trench intended to protect the view shed of a historical building in a rural area. A much better choice would have been the San Francisco Central Subway project now being constructed to connect Chinatown with 4th and Brannan Street. It is a 1.7-mile tunnel with 4 stations being bored through a dense urban area. The cost is $1.6 billion, half from federal sources and half from state and local sources. I have a link here to the website of the project for the staff information. I'll leave it at the desk. Then with regard to the transmittal memo, the memo says correctly that citizens came prepared and contributed many thoughtful questions and comments. However, there was no clear attempt by staff to account for the weight of these opinions at the meeting, in contradiction to previous meetings where there were votes held on various options. By my count, there were a total of 216 comments submitted that were logged, and 44 were pro-tunnel or trench, 7 were anti-tunnel or trench. A selection of some of the more illuminating comments were Process doesn't seem transparent. Remove ideas that upset many properties. Don't take people's homes. Concerned that the financial impediments to the more expensive options suggest the city has not been creative enough in finding solutions. Shoe fly, Alma can't be reduced by 2 traffic lanes. Traffic is already horrible. I feel the city is trying to direct us into a solution that the city wants or remove solutions the city doesn't want. Can we tunnel under Alma and reclaim land? No shoe fly for construction. Not enough info here to really make decision or answer questions. $1,000 employees tax per year for 2/3 of employees times 100,000 employees times 30 years is $2 billion. So finally, a quote from the report, staff asks participants to suggest potential solutions to the numerous significant constructability challenges in building a tunnel, including the estimated $3 billion construction cost. This is really an unfair burden to put on the public. This is a job for staff and the Technical Advisory Committee to do in collaboration with council or the stakeholder group in a CSS process. Thank you.
Next speaker, Martin Bernstein, to be followed by our finally public speaker on this item, Nadia Nayak.
Okay, it's Martin Bernstein, and I handed out to the city clerk the copies of the diagrams that I'd like to present. I don't know if you're able to see those before I speak, or
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Looks like they're going to be handed out. Okay, I guess not. Okay, Martin Bernstein, and welcome, Chair Walbach and other council members in good health, please. You're getting the comments I'm going to make. That way you can follow the diagrams as I mention them. Okay. So I am thinking about the following idea as a funding source for trenching or tunneling the railroad through Palo Alto and eliminating the grade crossings. I met with last year with Councilmember Fine and other council members, and this is just a repeat of that conversation, just so you could have it for the public record. And you have copies in front of you. This is the idea, and this was local paper maybe earlier this year. It was mentioned that Councilmember Fine reflected on this idea also. And here's the idea, 4 steps. City of Palo Alto to enter into a lease agreement between the railroad property owner and the City of Palo Alto for use of the air rights above the railroad right-of-way. City of Palo Alto to enter into lease agreements between City of Palo Alto and property developers for various sized airspace parcels. Developers apply for planning and building permits to construct housing, retail, and office buildings within the airspace parcels along an open space corridor with a continuous bike path as a public benefit. City of Palo Alto to structure the lease terms of the City of Palo Alto and property developer agreement so full cost recovery is received by City of Palo Alto for the cost of trenching or tunneling. There's a similar air rights arrangement between City of Palo Alto and a property developer currently successfully in effect at the properties listed on that piece of paper. There are 4 properties on High Street and Alma Street. Next page actually shows the math of how to collect $2,400,000 full cost recovery, and you can see the math. You can go through all that. And you can see on the last page.
Martin, if you could wrap it up pretty
Okay.
soon, thanks.
Okay, sure. And then you can see on the last page actually a map for 1.5 miles of that development to create the $2,800,000 of rental income to pay for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Final speaker on item 1, Nadia Nayak.
Hi. So I read through the various comments, and having attended the meeting, my impression was that I wouldn't say that the staff report fully captured what I think the public was saying. I think mostly what you were hearing was that they would like to remove alternatives where people's homes were at risk. But I did not hear them saying that they would like to remove all alternatives unilaterally, sorry, new braces, and try to narrow down that field. So I think it's while people want to make it more simple, they also wanted to be able to compare everything. That meeting was obviously guided towards just discussing trench and tunnel. But a lot of the people, I believe we did a poll at the very beginning, how many people were new to this topic. More than half the room was new. That was their very first meeting. So they had basic questions about other grade separations. They had basic questions about funding and financing, which I don't think were clear. The second thing is I didn't think that freight was widely understood. If you read through the questions, they don't quite understand it. I don't think people understood that even in a deep bore tunnel, freight would have to stay at the surface, right? That would be one of the things. And so, again, I think because the meeting was geared towards one topic, that they're sort of missing things. And finally, if you read through the comments, funding comes up again and again. I go back to the funding white paper. I know that those of us who come to these meetings have seen it. I just don't think that the public understands what the, quote, funding criteria is that we're using. And I think that that needs to be articulated better. And reading through those comments, it's clear that even those that did read it don't think that we've done a very good job with creative math. And I don't know what that means. I'm not a finance person, but obviously it's an ongoing concern. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll return to colleagues. Any questions or comments on item number 1? Adrian? Thank you. Thank you very much for the report and for hosting the meeting. Sorry I couldn't be there. Just a few high-level comments. One, I think it is helpful that we have more people showing up at these meetings, even if it is their first meeting. That is a good thing to get more folks engaged. I think a number of our speakers have touched on that we both want to engage the folks who have come to these meetings repeatedly, and we want to update and inform folks who may just be touching it tangentially. One speaker did ask about just a general meeting where it's not roundtables. I think that's a good idea, and if I'm correct, I think we do have a community meeting coming up where it's more of just an explanation. Is that right? And less of a roundtable?
I don't believe we have anything scheduled, but we are in conversation about doing that. We think it's a good idea also.
Thank you, because I think we talked about it at the last committee meeting. The comments and commentary in here, I would encourage my colleagues to read it. There's a lot of good color in there. I think the main things I pull out from that, people are still interested in a viaduct a little bit, a tunnel, property impacts rise to the top, and the last one is kind of this Silicon Valley, Stanford / call Elon Musk for a solution. I know that's not so concrete, but I think it is an important guide for us as we look at these different solutions. There's no action on this, so nothing else, but I would love to hear my colleagues' thoughts. Greg?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank staff for taking, was it their Saturday? Sunday? Wednesday evening, to go and do this. Glad we had such good participation. So I actually wanted to comment on Martin Bernstein's railway trench or cost recovery. I think that's really helpful, and I really appreciate the fact that you put it together because it highlights the impossibility of value recapture. It highlights that, to come anywhere close, we're talking about a wall of 8-story building there. And, I mean, if you think about the wars over 50 feet or 55 feet, to suddenly decide we're going to do 8-story buildings would be impossible to get there with the community. When you think about how long it took us to do the SOFA area plan, it was what, a 10, 12-year process, to actually come up with a plan. And you couldn't sell any of this till you actually had a development agreement where you would have said to developers, you have an absolute right to build this. No one's going to buy it with just the ability to go through the Palo Alto process. And then we're talking about leasing the stuff too, and so there's a discount for that. I mean, when you look at the complexities of any sort of value capture, not to mention that I don't think we own the land above it. I mean, I just don't think we own that. So I think this really highlights for me the impossibility of the value capture concepts that people throw out there. So I actually really appreciate the way you put that out. Thanks.
Lydia, any comments on this one?
So I was at the meeting, and there was a lot of confusion at the meeting itself when I'm walking through the tables. There was a lot of information that was provided, but actually I was a little bit perturbed by the way that it, for me, whenever I heard the presentation from the staff, it sounded more like a stirring type of thing where it was leading to what we cannot do, so we're left with only these few things that we can do. And, these are beginnings of community meetings, and I would really like to see that we provide more information to the general public. And while there is a lot of expertise in our general public that I've come to see and noticed, I don't think we provide enough information for them. You plot down this tunneling and trenching thing and this white paper on financing and stuff, and then you say what we cannot do, instead of looking at providing even more information. I see closures of Churchill and Palo Alto Avenue and East Meadow. And excuse me, I'm not feeling well today, so I'm just going to put it out there. But there's no circulation study mentioned. There's nothing that's going to tell us how is it going to be down the line when we have to deal with all these closures. I'm not seeing a method that you're doing here that actually provides a guidance to our residents and to the people here about how we're going to move forward. You're just providing so much information that means nothing to come to nothing. I'm sorry, but I was actually a little bit upset at the meeting at the way that it was going, and even the questions that was posed, it was, it's too expensive. It's way too expensive to do it, so, but if you're going to do it, why don't you tell us how we're going to do it? That's not a way to go about, engaging the community. So I would really love to see more. While I was sick and preparing for this meeting, I went onto the website to look for all the questions that people had written down. Couldn't find it anywhere. And believe me, that website, if I could throw my laptop and not have to go and reinvest in one, I would have done that. But I can't find anything on that website, and it really is frustrating. So there needs to be a better way where we're disseminating information. And yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just upset with all of this.
We heard a comment from the public today on this item that even with a deep bore tunnel, that freight would need to run at the surface. I was hoping whether staff could confirm or refute that or weigh in on that, or if you want to just respond to that comment with any additional information.
I don't think we have a firm answer on that today. That would be something that would come from additional analysis of a deep bore tunnel and consultation with the TAC and the freight railroad itself.
So that wasn't something that was looked at in the prior tunneling analysis?
I mean, the assumption in the tunneling paper was that freight would also run in the tunnel.
Okay.
But, we can't, UP has trackage rights to the existing corridor, so that would be a negotiation that would need to occur.
Okay.
Can I just follow up on that? Wouldn't we just say that if freight had to run on the surface, there would be no point in doing a tunnel? That it would make absolutely no sense?
So grade separate on top.
It would just, that would make no sense. So, I don't think it would take further analysis, and it would just be, that would make no sense, we wouldn't do that, and that's a silly idea.
Certainly does in value.
Well,
Adrian?
No, but there's two states of a tunnel, right? One state is where we have a tunnel with freight going through it, and if that's possible, then it's potential. If the freight is on top and we separately have a tunnel, I agree with you, that's a non-starter.
Yeah.
So have you even started conversation about the freight? Have you even reached out to Southern Pacific to see if they're still running the freight as frequently as they used to?
So I've done all of that.
And,
I have the
it'd be
answer
nice
to
to
that.
have a report then, because I have never heard anything from
I'd be
them.
happy
Well,
to
just,
address that.
Greg, why don't you weigh in with your, whatever your understanding is about freight on, it's Union Pacific through our corridor.
Right. So right now they are negotiating those issues. And
Who's the they?
Union Pacific and the JP, what do we call it? JPA? JPB. I knew I was going to get that wrong. And the JPB, Caltrain. So Caltrain and Freight are negotiating that right now. They said they're not going to know anything for another couple months. And that's going to, they're also discussing the 2% versus the 1%. They're discussing what trackage rights they get and what that looks like at the end of the day. So we should actually know something, they said, in 2 Yeah, 2 months, maybe 3 months.
Just to ask you a question then on that, do you know if they're considering whether to remove freight from the corridor or remove it from our portion of the corridor, or do you know which topics are under negotiation right now?
So I asked that direct question, and they said they're having those discussions, but their discussion, I don't think freight makes any money, but I think there are federal requirements to run freight, and the Port of Oakland really wants freight, and so does, I believe, Redwood City Port. And so I think those stakeholders really want freight to continue to run, and I think there's federal requirements to continue to run freight, but there are discussions about how that would work. So my guess is that freight will continue to run, but, you know, I think they would like it if freight didn't run, but, you know, I don't think they think that's likely.
Interesting. I think we'll get into this more when we move on to item 2. Any other comments on item number 1 before we move on?
Just regarding freight, I think that we want to make sure that it isn't a closed item since it's still open out there to discover more information. But also, secondly, I want to know if there is going to be freight that can be diverted towards the Dumbarton, if that one is going to be reopened since there is more freight lines on the east side. But I mean, I kind of want to make sure that we explore all the options on freight before we make a decision and close that down and say it's not something that can happen. And it'll be nice to have more frequent reports back on that.
I think the thing they're fighting for us on freight was the sense I got was the 1% possibility versus the 2%. And I think that was the big push that they were at least indicating to me that they were trying to get for us.
All right, Adrian, and then actually, just a reminder,
So-
with this committee, we have set a policy of, with action items, we'll hear from the public, go to committee members, and then allow members of the public to weigh in again, so that we can have more vibrant discussion input from the public. So after Adrian, we're going to go back to Nadia Nayak, and then we'll move on to item number 2.
See some of our members of the public rearing to go.
There's a whole nother item, which is the meat of today.
So I think, I kind of agree with Lydia, there's a bit more work to be done around freight, but I think we need to be specific about the issues we're interested in and the partners we're working with. So as far as I understand it, yes, there's an issue of whether freight needs to continue in this corridor, what, the opportunity cost is for the users of that system, whether it is the Port of Redwood City, Oakland, or UP. Additionally, we want some clarity on the 1% to 2% trench, the grade, so that we can understand what kind of trench systems we have. I think those are our 2 guiding questions. Could staff weigh in, though, actually on who is making those decisions? I don't think it's Caltrain and UP. Isn't it more like the state, isn't there like the rail plan and stuff that's more involved in this in terms of?
So UP has freight trackage rights to the corridor along the peninsula, which is owned by the JPB. Those are historic rights that, were inherited from a long time ago. They are currently working on procuring a short line operator jointly, and the short line operator would take over freight operations under contract from UP. What Councilmember Scharf was referring to is there were negotiations occurring between the JPB and UP about what the RFP for the short line operator would look like. And we've tried to get a look at that, and we've not been able to get a look at it. I have recently asked Caltrain whether they have done any cost estimating on how much it would cost to buy out UP and cease freight operations. They have not done any work on estimating what that would cost. That would be an option to end freight operations on the peninsula, would be to buy out the trackage rights from UP. But there's no number out there, as far as we know, as to what UP would be expecting for that.
So just for the public, the issue here is that we don't own the tracks, we don't own the land beneath the tracks, nor do we own the right to operate on the tracks. And if freight is to continue, we need some kind of arrangement where we understand how that will affect the grade separations we choose, whether they're hybrid solutions, undergrounding, tunnel, whatever it is.
If I could, just one more point, and the design requirement around the 1% grade, and for the benefit of the public, when the rail corridor rises or goes into a trench or a tunnel, the grade is the amount of distance it requires to get up to that new level or down below. So a 1% requires a great deal more distance than, let's say, a 2% grade. Currently, the freight railroads prefer 2%, and UP specifically. So Caltrain has a 1% design standard currently. They have offered some flexibility, a little more than 1%. To date, the only 2% grade that's been approved is for the Transbay Terminal connection, and that will not have freight operations. It will only have passenger rail operations. And the difference is Caltrain is going to electrify, and electric trains can climb a much steeper grade than long diesel-operated freight trains.
And then the 1% and 2% grade decision, is that by the state and the JPA? Because it's not, that's also out of our hands.
Yeah, it's a Caltrain design standard that is a result of UP constraints currently. So Caltrain can waive that. There's a variance procedure.
Is it only them, though? I mean, could
Well, the CPUC has oversight over all the
Okay.
railroad operations
That's what I was
in
looking for.
California.
Okay, so, UP, Caltrain own the tracks, the rights to run them, but the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, actually runs a decision about whether we get that waiver for a 2%. Anyways, I'll pass it off.
All right, so we have a couple of folks who want to weigh in again on this item, and then we'll be moving on to the main item where we actually talk about the various grade separation options. So we'll have Nadia and I, followed by Roland Burke.
Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to have a second round of public comment. I really do think it's super helpful. This conversation elicits for me the clarity that we absolutely need to have a primer on freight. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it, just hearing the different impressions that everybody has. For example, it's my understanding that Transbay hasn't been finalized. The plans to get into San Francisco haven't been finalized, so I don't know how we could have a 2% design standard yet when they haven't actually chosen any route, for example. The most important thing is, I would agree with what Councilmember Scharf said. Yes, Caltrain and Union Pacific have been in negotiations for a short line operator. However, they're doing that for a different reason. Caltrain does not, or Union Pacific does not want to show anywhere in the state that they are running an electrified railroad with freight. Because if they do that, they have to change things with operations in Southern California where Metrolink is. So Union Pacific's workaround is that they're having a short line operator operate on their behalf, even though they're setting the price, the schedules, and everything, and that's how they get around that. This is part of a larger game. The option of whether or not Union Pacific operates on the Caltrain right-of-way is not really something that Caltrain controls. This is part of a state rail plan and a state rail game, let's call it. This is a chess piece in part of a larger part of the network. And Union Pacific owns a lot of land, specifically in places that overlap with the high-speed rail project. So when we talk about negotiations for having heavy freight or light freight or anything really related to freight, it really isn't about Caltrain and Union Pacific because they have a trackage rights agreement, but the state above that is the ones that might be able to buy off the rights for freight. Later in my comments for the next thing, you'll see that one of the things I suggest is that when we're asking the consultants to look at design specifications, we look at the difference between what it costs to do grade separations for heavy freight or for light freight. And when you have a number associated with that cost, you will understand the magnitude of the importance of freight on the peninsula and the effect it has on the entire line in terms of how much it costs. Thank you.
All right, we just got a couple more cards. These will be our last speakers on this item. Roland LeBrun, Adina Levin, and Martin Bernstein in that order. 2 minutes each.
So there are a lot of opinions here, and I'm not here to agree or disagree with any of them. But I'd like to do is to bring to your attention the actual chapter and verse of what's going on here. And all that you have to do is to Google Caltrain agreements. And if you do that, you're going to land on a page called the JPB agreements. The specific agreement that is relevant to the discussion here is called the deal terms sheet related to transfer of rights and responsibilities. And that basically is going to be chapter and verse about the entire process, about what's going on right now. The one thing I would appreciate this committee's help from is to actually convince Caltrain to convert all these documents out there to searchable PDFs. Okay, they're not being transparent. It's absolutely impossible to find anything in there unless you read the entire document. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roland. Next speaker, Adina Levin, followed by Martin Bernstein, and then we will move on to item 2.
Adina Levin, friend of Caltrain. Just wanted to report a few things on that I have
seen and heard regarding the freight topic. And one is that most, if not all, of the freight that passes by here is coming from the Port of Redwood City, where they have a recycling facility, and they also have a building materials firm. They move the building materials sometimes across the bay, and then it heads south. And the Port of Redwood City contributes a non-trivial amount to the operating budget of the city of Redwood City. Last time I looked, it was on the line of what it takes them to run their library. And, you know, while it's not vast sums of money, not billions of dollars, it's still notable for their budget. So some solution that in the short term had no freight would need to address the budget implications for City of Redwood City. And in addition, if the port is operating, then the alternative to freight trains is trucks, and having trucks with all of that material traveling through Redwood City neighborhoods. And so, you know, that too would have its own consequences. The other issue with regard to freight and moving it over Dumbarton is the Dumbarton tracks run through neighborhoods in Menlo Park and North Fair Oaks, and in proposals for the Dumbarton corridor, there's been some significant local controversy about the possibility of running diesel buses on that right-of-way, and I strongly suspect that if there was a proposal to run freight trains on that corridor, there would similarly be community feedback. It's, you know, not an issue of, you know, people don't like it here, and therefore it will, problems elsewhere will not exist. So those are some of the things to consider.
Thank you. Last speaker, Martin Bernstein.
Thank you, Chair Walbach, and for keeping this as an interactive meeting today. Councilmember Scharf brought up a very important point about community buy-in if there are going to be tall structures along the right-of-way. Proposed Senate Bill 827 may usurp city's local control on building height, and that's to be seen. Certainly, and you can see on my proposed map that most of that development, it would be in the downtown area. So that could be a place that could support higher structures. Certainly, you know, here's some mathematics for full cost control. If half of that is done, then there might be some other sources of funding. But this is just a suggestion of some mathematics of how things can happen. City Manager Keene mentioned at the roundtable another important aspect of that financing and payment scheduling. How do you get a loan on future income? So that's certainly another challenge. But there are a lot of very creative people in this room, and agreements, I believe, can be structured for presenting all possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's go on to item number 2. Next, item number 2, we'll receive a report on the initial screening of the master list of ideas for the Connecting Palo Alto Rail Program. Staff?
Please. Okay. Good morning, Josh Mello, Chief Transportation Official. Thanks for having me here today. I'm here to present on the Connecting Palo Alto Rail Program Master List of Ideas Initial Screening. This presentation was included in your packet for the benefit of transparency and to give you a forward look at what we were bringing to you today. In front of you today is a more detailed scoring sheet that was not included in the packet, and I'll be glad to discuss that later after my presentation. So first, I'm going to give you a little primer on the different types of grade separations and grade crossing improvements. You know, we've talked a lot about what some of the potential solutions are, but we've never gone through each potential option in a thorough manner. So, you know, a lot of people you'll hear say there must be only 2 or 3 possible solutions for our grade crossings. That's not actually the case. We have 4 separate locations in Palo Alto. We have Charleston, Churchill, Meadow, and Palo Alto Avenue. Palo Alto Avenue is also known as Alma Street to some folks. We also have some options that would include, collections of these 4 locations. So some ideas that have been put out there include both Charleston and Meadow. There's other options that have been put on the table that are citywide solutions. So we not only have the 4 locations, but we have some potential options that would include multiple locations. That's multiplied by 7 different potential options that you see in the second row there, and I'm going to go into more detail on these. These are different ways that railroads and other jurisdictions have improved railroad crossings. So to the far left, you have the no bill, do nothing option. Following is a closure option, road under rail, road over rail. And then the last 3, the rail is actually moved to a new elevation. So the hybrid is kind of a splitting the difference option. And then rail under road and rail over road. And I'm going to go into more detail on these, but I want to further highlight that the last row you see there, there's actually variations to these options. So there's even more complexity than just the 7 potential options. There's, a closure could be completely closed to all modes, or it could just be closed to motor vehicles and we build a parallel bike ped crossing. So the first option that's available to us is a road closure at the tracks. We actually have one of these already in Palo Alto. California Avenue used to cross the rail corridor, and when Oregon Expressway was constructed, California Avenue grade crossing was closed, and a separate bike ped tunnel was built underneath. It's actually just a ped tunnel that is used by both cyclists and pedestrians. And that connects the 2 former connected segments of California Avenue. Some of the pros of this is, it's an immediate safety improvement. You eliminate all the horn noise from the train for the crossing. In our case, the Alma Street intersections would be improved because you would no longer have that 4th leg of the intersection. It would become a T intersection, which would mean fewer signal phases potentially, and a quicker, smoother operation of the traffic signal at those locations. They're also very low cost, especially if you don't add any new bike ped connectivity. They would be very minimal cost compared to some of the other options. Some of the negatives of a closure are increasing traffic at nearby crossings. So all of the traffic that currently uses the existing grade crossing would have to be moved to another location. And then it can also create longer routes for bicyclists and pedestrians, which could lead to more motor vehicle trips. People may not find walking and biking to be as convenient any longer and may drive instead. The next option that's on the table for us is to lower the road and the pedestrian and bicyclists under the tracks. So an example of this is the Embarcadero undercrossing that we have currently. This is where the road is lowered completely underneath. The rail corridor stays at grade. Again, this would increase safety, eliminate the train horn noise, improve traffic flow. Some of the cons are this could actually increase traffic along the roadway that's grade separated. And this is common among all of the grade separation options. Because of the improved operations along the corridor and the improvement at the Alma intersections, specifically, more people could flock to that particular roadway, and it could actually increase traffic. There could also be...
So wait, Josh, when you say that, where would they come from? I assume there's a finite number of people need to go wherever they're going. So wouldn't they then come off somewhere else?
So the circulation study was kind of a look at this, and it determined that people would actually come from all over to use, particularly the Charleston grade crossing.
But would there be traffic somewhere else that's less than?
Yeah, there's diversion. There's also new trips that occur. Trips become more convenient, and more people actually make trips specifically during the peak hour. So the circulation study goes into fairly good detail about where the trips are coming from. But the end result is, the corridor could end up carrying more traffic. These would also, these types of undercrossings could result in pretty significant property impacts. The road has to start descending pretty far back from the rail corridor, and you could cut off driveways and potentially pieces of property and potentially require taking entire parcels because the access could be interrupted completely. And there's also significant utility impacts potentially if there's underground utilities. You're talking about relocating utility, pumping stormwater, other things. Next up is raising the road and the pedestrians and bicyclists over the tracks. If I could go back to just the lower road under the tracks. One of the positives of this is that the bicyclists and pedestrians don't have to go as far down as the cars. So from a pedestrian bicycle circulation perspective, this has less impact because you're only going down. Yes, if you look at University, the sidewalks are elevated above the road, so the grade change for bicyclists and pedestrians is not as significant as it would be for the next one, which is raising the road over the tracks. And we have an example of this at San Antonio Road in South Palo Alto, Mountain View city limits. This is where the road starts to ramp up over the rail corridor, and the rail corridor elevation does not change. This has some of the same benefits of the others. One of the unique cons to this one is that pedestrians and bicyclists could be deterred from using it because of how significant the grade change is for them, because they'd be at the same level of the road, and with the overhead catenary for the electrified Caltrain, we have to go pretty high over the tracks. So you could actually see a lot of pedestrian bicycle trips diverted or converted into motor vehicle trips if we were to do one of these. And these also go very, very far back and have pretty significant property impacts along the approaching roadways because of how far you have to go back to ramp up to get up and over the rail corridor. A compromise solution is what we call a hybrid. And this is where the roadway is lowered slightly and then the tracks are elevated slightly. And we have an example of this at both University Avenue and Homer Tunnel. If you stand on University Avenue and look at the grade crossing, you can actually see the rail corridor is elevated slightly. And the same at Homer Tunnel. Homer Tunnel, you're not going down completely below the grade level of the street. The rail corridor is actually elevated a little bit above Alma Street at Homer. And the benefits of this are that the property impacts could potentially be reduced pretty substantially because the roadway is not ramping down as much, and therefore it doesn't require you to start ramping down as far back as you would for a full undercrossing. Another example of this treatment is in San Carlos, and one of the things they've been able to do there, which I think is a creative way to do this, is they have a pedestrian underpass that's very open and airy underneath the station, and it doesn't feel like a tunnel. It's a little bit of a plaza area, so they've actually created a pretty open area that doesn't feel intimidating and unsafe for pedestrians. It's in San Carlos, and they also use some decorative stonework on the outside, so the retaining walls aren't typical concrete retaining walls.
Just to clarify, the
yes.
area you're talking about at San Carlos Ave is not the Holly Street grade separation.
Yes, Holly.
It's just it's an independent cut into the berm, which just raises separate questions about what berms look like and what a hybrid solution looks like along its length, but that's not specific to the grade separation. I just want to clarify that.
So the hybrid solution in San Carlos crosses Holly Street, and there's a separate pedestrian underpass that's at the station. But they're both a hybrid. The pedestrians actually have to step down a little bit and then come back up, but they're not going fully underneath because the rail corridor is elevated.
On a berm.
It's on a retaining wall there, and then I think on the approaches it's on a berm.
Got it.
So it could be a berm or a retaining wall, depending on what right of way is available. A variation of this would be to slightly depress the rail corridor and then slightly elevate the roadways. There's not really an example of that we can pull from, but that is a potential option as well. Then we could lower the railroad tracks under the local streets, and this is the focus of the trenching and tunneling paper that was distributed earlier this year. Couple variations to this. We could do a bored tunnel, a deep bore tunnel. We could do a cut and cover tunnel, or we could do an open trench. All of these are considered lowering the railroad tracks under the local road. Some of the pros to these are similar to a lot of the other ones, with the exception of the deep bore tunnel, which would have very minimal construction impacts. The only real impacts would be at the entry points for the tunnel boring machines, and then the construction of the ventilation structures along the tunnel. Cons to this are the trenches, and the open trench and the cut and cover would have very significant construction impacts. We're talking about a shoe fly track for the full length of the new cut and cover tunnel or trench if it's constructed within the existing rail corridor. There's also some pretty significant operations and maintenance issues with these. Caltrain and UP, for all intents and purposes, have no interest in operating in a tunnel or trench. They do want to see grade separations, but their preference would be to do something that continues to give them the flexibility to, potentially expand in the future or use their right of way. So putting them in a trench and tunnel, it's, pretty unlikely that they're going to take over the operations and maintenance costs of a trench and tunnel. So we could potentially be on the hook for ongoing operations and maintenance, and they could be pretty significant depending on the length and the, how substantial the tunnel and trench is. Another option that's on the table is to elevate the railroad tracks over the local road. So this would be a berm or a viaduct. You could also use retaining walls. An example of this is in San Bruno, downtown San Bruno. The rail corridor there is elevated through most of the downtown. It's a has pretty significant visual impacts on the community. There could be fewer property impacts than some of the other solutions. If we were to do this in the existing rail corridor, though, we would need to do the shoe fly track and create a temporary track alignment in order to construct the elevated portion of the roadway. Probably the most significant con of this, based on what we've heard from the community, is the visual impacts. And there are people along the corridor who are concerned that train riders would be able to look into their backyards over their fencing, and they'd lose some of the privacy that they currently have with their fencing. So Ed gave you an overview of our mission for 2018, both at the council retreat and at the last rail committee meeting. Essentially, we are trying to get to one preferred solution by this December. And we're starting with 34 ideas, and I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of where those 34 ideas came from. We need to get from 34 ideas, ideally down to 4 to 8 alternatives for study by June. And the reason we need to get down to 4 to 8 alternatives for study is we're estimating it costs between $200,000 and $300,000 to do a detailed analysis of each alternative. So if we were to do all 34 ideas, it's a tremendous amount of money that we'd be spending. So the goal is to get it down to 4 to 8. An alternative for study, there's a glossary that I included in your packet. An idea becomes an alternative for study when we decide, and council decides that it warrants detailed analysis. It will be decided by council. That detailed analysis will include things like circulation, traffic analysis, detailed construction impact analysis. And the preferred solution that we identify in December, which will also go to council, is going to be a collection of alternatives. So it'll be one alternative for each of the 4 grade crossings. There may be a combination. We may end up selecting a similar option for Charleston and Meadow, and thereby we would have 3 alternatives that make up that preferred solution. So the staff's opinion today is that the best way to get down to that 4 to 8 in June is to start by doing some initial screening of these 34 ideas. The 34 ideas came from the extensive public outreach that we did in 2017 as well as early 2018. Just to refresh your memory, we have a project website that we are working to update on an ongoing basis. We did an online questionnaire last year. We had about 800 responses, which is pretty amazing for an online questionnaire. We held 2 community workshops with a total of 228 attendees, 4 community roundtables, which had 381 attendees. We've also had 13 rail committee meetings since beginning this process, collected 63 public comments and inquiries. We are working on assembling those public comments into a document that will be available to the public. We're trying to organize them by themes to make it more legible, and we'll also be providing comments and responses to some of the common themes that have been identified in the public comments. We have a database of interested stakeholders, which we've been continuing to meet with throughout this process, and then we've used a newsletter and social media to continually keep people involved in the project. At the roundtable, the roundtables that we had last year, one of the things we asked people to do was to identify their preferred scenarios. So this is a card that was distributed, and we asked people to identify 3 different unique scenarios. And each of those letters in the columns represent one of the options that I just gave you an overview of. So C is for closure, U is for road under rail, et cetera. And we collected these from all of the 3 roundtables that we held last year. And it did produce, this says 40 grade separation ideas, but it's actually 34. We were estimating 40. And then once we started to refine them and, combine them into logical ideas, we got to 34 different ideas. We haven't taken anything off the table. Everything that the public has suggested is represented in those 34 ideas. And what we did after assembling the 34 ideas is we took the criteria that council adopted back in September 6th of 2017. This was the evaluation criteria that was identified for the evaluation of the grade separation ideas. And we started to group those together into 4 different categories. So you actually adopted a Tier 1 and Tier 2 list of criteria. The thought being Tier 1 was the most important, and then Tier 2 was important as well, but not the most important. So under the technical category, some of the Tier 1 criteria include facilitate movement of all modes, reduce delay and congestion, provide safe bicycle and pedestrian routes, support rail operations. Tier 2 under technical, reduce rail noise, minimize visual changes, maintain or improve local access. And then under financial, there's a Tier 1 evaluation criteria, which is finance with feasible funding sources. And I know this committee had a lot of discussion about how to word that, but what we ended up with is finance with feasible funding sources. Property impacts are also important. Minimizing right-of-way acquisition is a Tier 2 criteria. That means that we should give preference to options that would minimize the requirement to acquire property. And lastly, under construction, there's a Tier 2 evaluation criteria, which is minimize disruption and duration from construction, of construction. So this would be minimize the time it takes to construct an alternative and also minimize the impacts to Alma Street, adjacent properties, community circulation, bike ped access during the construction phase. So after creating the list of 34 ideas from public feedback, we created a matrix, which on the left column there, we've created a unique ID for each of the different ideas. It's a 3-letter code that somewhat represents what the option is, what the idea is. And then we have a description of the idea. And then the Tier 1 and Tier 2 criteria, followed by a list of 3 new criteria that we developed that we thought were important in order to truly evaluate and score the master list of ideas. The last column is a Y or an N, and this represents whether, based on the initial screening scores, we recommend that it move into the next phase of analysis. We did identify 2 fatal flaw criteria. Funding feasibility and constructability. And funding feasibility, a green check mark means that it's possible that the entire project can be funded with established revenue sources. A yellow X means it's possible that the majority of the project can be funded with established revenue sources, although some portion will likely require new funding mechanisms. And we also believe that these ones could potentially qualify for state and federal funding. And lastly, a red X represents the staff opinion that the cost of the project exceeds the capacity of existing revenue sources and any potential revenue sources. And we also feel that the ones with a red X would not compete well for state and federal grant funding. These are all qualitative scores done by staff. We do intend to have these verified, by our consultant, our new consultant, once they come on board. The other fatal flaw that we've identified is the constructability criteria, and that is whether something can be built within existing design standards and the existing political structure. So that, again, is a qualitative assessment by staff. The last column, which is a series of question marks, is the opinion of the Technical Advisory Committee on the idea. We did present this to the Technical Advisory Committee last week, and they have a copy of this, and they're going to be getting their feedback to us prior to the next Rail Committee meeting, and we're hoping to have this column completed at that point in time. So included in your packet is a list of a matrix of 16 ideas based on the results of the initial screening criteria. These are the 16 highest scoring ideas. At this point, staff is not making any recommendation or asking the committee for a recommendation. This is just the results of the initial screening that we've conducted to date. And along the top are the different locations. So you see citywide, Palo Alto, Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston. And then along the left side, the rows represent the different types of options that were available to us. And based on the initial screening, the ideas that have scored well fall into a couple different categories of options. The first are the closure ideas. So there are 5 closure ideas that scored well in our initial screening. The first is PCE. This is where the Palo Alto Avenue grade crossing would be closed, and a new bicycle and pedestrian crossing would be constructed at Everett Avenue. And there are adopted planning documents that identify a new bicycle and pedestrian crossing at Everett Avenue, so this is consistent with previous planning efforts. What we would need to do if we decided to advance this is analyze what the traffic impacts would be to closing Palo Alto Avenue and whether University could handle the additional load without impacting surrounding neighborhoods and, especially downtown north. Idea PCU is closing Palo Alto Avenue and widening or making improvements to the existing University Avenue undercrossing.
So why, I'm confused as to why widening University is different. I'm confused as to why widening University and doing an Everett bike plan are different ideas. Why it wouldn't be widen University and do Everett bike pedestrian.
So you're gonna have the same question about the next two, which
right, that's what I was now.
Our response to that is we could combine them. We could certainly. They're currently discrete ideas, but our thought is that they can be combined in order to further reduce the number of ideas on the table. So that's certainly something that the committee could direct us to do. So PCU would, as it is currently defined, would just make improvements to University, but there could be a combined PCE, PCU idea. CAE is to close Churchill Avenue and then widen the Embarcadero Road undercrossing. The Embarcadero Road undercrossing currently has 2 lanes going westbound and only 1 lane going eastbound. There's also no bike lanes through the tunnel at Embarcadero, and the sidewalks are a little bit constrained. So this would make improvements to that undercrossing and then close the Churchill Avenue crossing. Similar to that, the CAS idea would close Churchill Avenue and then build a new bicycle and pedestrian crossing at Seal Avenue.
So why Seal, not Churchill?
So Seal is planned to be a bike boulevard in our bike ped plan, and if you cross at Seal, you can actually go through Piers Park and connect to Stanford Avenue, and Stanford Avenue is also a bike boulevard corridor that runs all the way into College Terrace. So you would have a complete east-west bike route if you were to construct it at Seal. That being said, doing something also at Churchill could be something that is, added to one of these
that's
ideas
where
as well.
Kids cross. That's why I'm trying to. It doesn't make sense to me that we wouldn't do it at Churchill.
Mm-hmm. So you go there in the mornings, right? You've been there, right? I mean, it's crazy number of kids. Yeah, so that we have talked to the community about that, and I think at the end of the day, Churchill, we're going to have to combine some of the ideas and add, potentially add a bike crossing at Churchill as well. I mean, we've been talking about that. I don't see it on here. Yeah, so that can be added at the next go-round. We can certainly do that. Last on this list of closure ideas is... So I got to ask one other question, so I'm on it. I've had a bunch of questions in the community about why you're out doing community meetings about doing improvements on the Churchill bike stuff when we're going to probably close Churchill or do a major redoing of Churchill. And
if we're going to do a bike and pedestrian underpass there, are we wasting our money doing those bike improvements now? I've asked a lot of people have asked me that, and I thought maybe you could just address it.
Sure. So the city-funded project along Churchill runs from the intersection of Castellea Avenue to El Camino Real, and those improvements will
On the west side of Baldwin.
yeah. So those improvements will continue to have utility regardless of what happens at the grade crossing, because it continues the bike path that comes along the rail corridor and will connect it to the Stanford Perimeter Trail. So even if the Churchill crossing is closed, those will still have independent utility, and I don't think it'd be, unwise use of money to make those improvements.
It's also part of improving the intersection at
Yeah.
El Camino and Churchill Right, and improving the right turn on El Camino off of Churchill.
Yes. And then there's a separate project that's entirely federally funded to make safety improvements at the grade crossing. That's not city money. It's interim safety improvements that are being funded through the CPUC and Caltrans. So we're not putting any funding into that, and they think it's still wise to move forward with that project regardless of what we're doing in the realm of grade separation. So the last idea on the table for under the closure category is to close Meadow Drive and then build a Loma Verde bike ped crossing. And Loma Verde would actually tie into Margarita, Matadero, and the Ballpark Path. So again, you would have a really nice east-west bike connection all the way from West Bayshore to Los Altos via the existing bike facilities. And that is also a planned bike ped crossing that's in the county bicycle expenditure plan, as well as eligible for Measure B funding under the bike ped program. So one of the things we need to do with this is, again, look at the traffic impacts of closing Meadow, and then see if the crossing at Loma Verde actually would serve the bicyclists and pedestrians that are using Meadow in combination with Charleston. The next category of ideas are the hybrid ideas, and there's 6 hybrid ideas that scored well in our initial screening. The first is PAH. This is a hybrid at Palo Alto Avenue. So if you remember when Menlo Park came to present to us a couple months ago, they said they have 2 options on the table. One is a hybrid, and they're going to be making a decision at their council in April, it looks like, to select a preferred alternative. But one of the alternatives that is at the top of their list that they'll be bringing to council is a hybrid where the rail corridor is elevated slightly, and Ravenswood and Oak Grove are depressed slightly. Their current plans show them coming down just before San Francisco Creek and using the existing trestle. But if you could imagine, we could continue the hybrid on some type of structure across the creek and then depress Palo Alto Avenue slightly, go over Palo Alto Avenue, and then come down just before our train station at University Avenue. So we could potentially partner with them and build it all as one project. They're on a similar timeline as we are with our grade separations. So that could be a potential option for Palo Alto Avenue. CAH is a Churchill Avenue hybrid, so this is very similar to what you see at Homer Avenue, except it would be a road. The road would go underneath the rail as well as bike ped connections. MCL is a Meadow and Charleston hybrid that also includes a Loma Verde undercrossing. So this would be a hybrid where the rail corridor is elevated over Loma Verde, Meadow, and Charleston. And we build the new Loma Verde undercrossing, and then we put Meadow and Charleston underneath the rail corridor, but the rail corridor is elevated slightly on either a berm or retaining walls. MCH is the same, but without the Loma Verde crossing. So this would just be a hybrid across Meadow and Charleston. And I apologize that some of these seem duplicative, but they are discrete ideas initially. But as I said, I think we're going to end up combining these as we move forward.
So when you say the $200,000 to $300,000, I mean, if we combine them, and wouldn't it make sense then, can you mix and match and say, well, okay, well, the extra cost of doing the bike pedestrian or the extra cost of this or that, is that how that's going to work? I'm just trying to get a sense of when you get to 4 to 8, it seems that we probably will combine a bunch.
Yeah. So the preferred scenario that council will adopt in December is going to have to look at the total financial package of all 4 locations, and there's going to be some give and take. as to, in order to, once we figure out what our financial ceiling is for the entire package.
The question, though, is, do we anticipate sort of economies of scale when we mash some of these up and we get more bang for our buck rather than 200 plus 200 plus 200?
So I do have to comment on that as well. So when you put in, for instance, the Seal Avenue bike ped or I guess the Loma Verde one, those are already in our bike plan. So that to me seems that it's really not part of the grade crossing, especially the Seal Avenue one, to be quite honest. That's part of our bike plan, and we should be funding that through Measure B funds or whatever. So I actually wonder why that's in here, frankly. It doesn't seem like it should be. I mean, it might be part of a circulation study or something with bikes. I might agree with that. But that seems to me something we should be going ahead and funding if it's part of the bike plan anyway.
Appreciate those comments. Thank you.
All right, let's finish the presentation.
IDEA MDH is a hybrid at Meadow, and IDEA CRH is a hybrid at Charleston. So, we could end up doing something different at Meadow and Charleston, so these would accommodate that. But at the end of the day, we're probably going to have to, combine whatever ideas we have for Meadow and Charleston in order to make sure that they work together seamlessly.
Actually, before you go on, so actually what we were talking about earlier at the up in San Carlos at Holly Street and San Carlos Avenue, I just want to point out that of the two pictures on this slide, the one on the left is Holly Street, and the one on the right is San Carlos Avenue. So the one on the left is the top-down view of
right here.
Of a car crossing hybrid, and the one on the right is the street view one is actually of a street being closed and then bike and ped only. Kind of like a more open-aired version of what we have at Homer. So for those who have envisioned, say, closing Churchill but leaving it open to bikes and pedestrians, this would be a version of that would be on a hybrid. And also, just wanted to clarify, I think we'll probably ask more questions after the presentation. So would you describe what's seen here in the photograph, the street view photograph, San Carlos Avenue, and by the way, that's actually at the train station, so the train station is elevated, and that's why it says San Carlos up there, because that's the train station itself. Would you call that a viaduct, or would you call that a retaining wall? I'm trying to get clear on the terminology.
So that is a hybrid bike ped under rail. Approaching what you see here, there are retaining walls, and then I guess I would call the open area there a viaduct structure.
Okay.
But that's it only goes a little bit past the edge of the photograph here.
Right, so
and then to the left and right, there are retaining walls that have a kind of a sandstone decorative block.
So in San Carlos, it actually goes from berm to retaining walls to viaduct at San Carlos Avenue.
If you were to call that a viaduct, yes.
Okay, thanks.
And then finally, we have our no-build ideas. This is where we would do nothing except safety upgrades. And the safety upgrades would include features that would ultimately allow us to advance a quiet zone. And for the benefit of the public, a quiet zone is where you install safety features, enhanced safety features that allow the trains to cross without sounding their horn. So it reduces some of the noise from the corridor. There are questions, it's not an open and shut case as to whether quiet zones make a crossing safer. They're primarily to deal with noise. But some of the enhancements that are required do make it a lot harder for intrusion into the track area. So our assumption here is that we would make safety upgrades. We wouldn't just leave them as is, but we're calling it no build because there's no actual grade separation included. And the only ones that scored well in the initial screening are Palo Alto Avenue, Churchill, and Meadow. Charleston carries too much traffic and would create too many circulation issues for a no build scenario to advance. And if you remember, we also when we went over the closure options, Charleston did not score well on the closure idea either. And then we have rail under road ideas. So MCT is a Meadow and Charleston trench. Some important points around this. Based on our trenching and tunneling paper, we would need to get a variance from Caltrain currently, under their current design standards, we would need to get a variance from Caltrain to do a 2% grade, which is almost twice as steep as what their current design standards allow, which is 1%. And that's in order to get down after Matadero Creek and then up again before San Antonio Station. So that is a potential fatal flaw for this option if we can't get concurrence with Caltrain on the variance for the 2%. MCX gives us a little bit more flexibility on grade. MCX would be a trench just under Charleston. And if you can think about Meadow and Charleston are very close together. So if you're ramping down from Matadero Creek to go under Charleston, at the point where the rail corridor crosses Meadow, it would not be far enough down to allow Meadow to cross at grade. So we're thinking Meadow could become a bike ped only, or potentially you could elevate the roadway slightly to get over. But this would give you a greater distance to get down from Matadero Creek to Charleston, but you still have the constraint between Charleston and San Antonio Station, which requires the 2%. So this gives you a little more flexibility on the grade on the north end of the trench, but no flexibility on the south end because Charleston is still your defining point.
So I'm confused. On your initial looking at this, if we had to do 1% grade, are both infeasible, or is just the Meadow Close Charleston Trench feasible?
They're both infeasible because both of them would require 2% between Charleston and San Antonio.
So they're both infeasible if we don't get the 2%?
If we don't get the 2% variance. And that concludes my presentation, and I'll let Rob jump in too with next steps. But our intent here is to just present the results of our initial screening to you today. We're not asking for a recommendation or any decisions. We would like your input onto as to modifications you'd like to see. Rob's going to talk about some of the outreach we're going to do over the next several weeks before we come back to you with this same item in early April.
Yeah, just quickly, thanks, Josh, for that presentation. And clearly, we've been doing a lot of work on this, trying to bring this forward so that we can start narrowing the options in a constructive and sensible way. We know that the community is very interested in this for good reason, and we have some community members that are very engaged and actually bring a lot of technical knowledge and expertise as well. So what we intend to do over the next month is have several meetings with some of the folks that are here actually, and sit down and sort of walk through the staff's thinking about how we did this and how we applied the council criteria to do this initial scoring to see if there were things we missed, and there likely are. And so we'll be doing that over the next month, as well as some additional sort of larger community meetings just to create greater awareness.
All right. I think we all have a lot of questions, but if it's all right with my colleagues, I think we go to the public, and we'll do the same thing where you just don't have to speak at both, but if you want to speak now or at the end or both, you're welcome to. We'll do 2 minutes each. So our first speaker is Stephen Rosenblum. Any others? Thank you, Stephen.
Hi. I think that the process that we're going through right now is a little bit premature. Presentation of these 16 staff-chosen ideas is not really in the spirit of what the process is supposed to be. I think at this meeting, it should still be open, and at the next meeting is when the process should be winnowed down. And it's pretty clear from the presentation that the staff is biased against a tunnel or trench option citywide and can no longer claim objectivity in any further analysis. The council should consider hiring a consultant to take over the management of the entire process from the city staff, which appears overloaded by this project. We should not allow the large scope of this project to overburden staff and force a hasty decision which will affect the appearance of our city for at least a century. A more intensive, results-oriented process must be used, employing a stakeholder group consisting of Palo Alto community members, staff, and technical experts that meet at least twice a month. I've taken the liberty of grading the bored tunnel border to border, option WBR, which was left out of the discussion today. according to the matrix on the slide, evaluation criteria with sample ideas. You saw this earlier in Josh's presentation. It scores a filled circle on every criterion. It only fails on financing and constructability, which is a new criterion proposed by staff and not yet approved by council. And the constructability issues are mainly the 2% grade and how freight is to be handled. I would like to suggest also that an important criterion also be the apparent equity of the chosen configuration in its treatment of the entire Palo Alto community. Any approach that sacrifices one neighborhood for another will not fly. The most important thing at this point is to get the process right, so we will not be facing an acrimonious state of affairs like that which occurred during the early 1960s during the Oregon Expressway project. That configuration decision had to be finally settled by a narrowly decided referendum election, which spawned the residentialist movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Next, Adina Levin, to be followed by Nadia Nayak. And if anyone else wants to speak right now, put in your cards right away. Of course, you can speak at the end of this item as well.
Adina Levin, Friends of Caltrain, and wanted to make a comment about the issues and challenges regarding funding and financing as they relate to the options that are considered to be viable. And, Mayor Scharf had mentioned in response to a comment by a community member that, people in the community would be likely to reject certain land use alternatives out of hand, and it wouldn't be worth having a public discussion. However, at the community meeting that I was at, I think people, they had the report that had the funding and financing, but really weren't connecting the dots, and also didn't really have the information before them about the relative costs, relative revenues, and relative land use trade-offs and choices, and would think that it would be healthy to have a public and open and honest discussion about funding and financing and the more expensive options, and to have the community members be able to weigh in honestly, do I hate a split alternative more that would be less costly, or would I hate looking at taller buildings more? To be a little bit too informal here. I think that those choices should be provided to the community members with price tags and options. And lastly, regarding that, the report did talk about either using property taxes and bonds or using value capture, and the value capture had a timing issue. So one consideration might be having a combination where the property tax backs bonds could provide money up front while the value capture revenue came in later. So.
Thank you, Adina. Nadia Nayak, to be followed by Leanna Hunt, and final speaker, Jeff Brown.
Hi, so unfortunately I have a termite inspector coming to my house, so I have to make my comment and leave and don't get 2 bites at the apple, so I'm going to talk fast. Just procedurally, number one, there's number two attachments. So for example, the scoring report that's over on the table, there was no more copies when I got in, and I don't know that everyone was able to get a copy of the scoring report. My concern from a public process standpoint was that we were not able to see the scoring report until today, so members of the public don't actually have a chance to be able to say whether they agreed or disagreed with how this criteria was applied. Number two, I noticed also on the table that there's an attachment that is unnumbered, which shows the tentative committee schedule going forward. It describes the initial screening of master list of ideas, which is today's meeting. And then it says final review of master list of ideas with the number 16 next to it. The master list of ideas, according to the glossary, was the list of all ideas. So when you've narrowed it down to 16, that's no longer the master list. That is now the screened list. So clearly, you are eliminating some alternatives before you're going to a complete city council vote. And that gets me to my big point of my 11-page of comments that I've turned in, which I know is available on the table, that, we had established a CSS process that was going to do problem evaluation or problem definition and evaluation criteria. The staff has amended the criteria appropriately. I actually think there needs to be even more criteria added. But if we're going to be discussing the criteria, we're not really ready to apply the elimination of alternatives for exactly the reasons that Councilmember Scharf was saying. If there's more than one project that we're already doing that might actually be beneficial to be included or might save us some money or we could combine dollars, we need to look at all those things. So I think procedurally, we really do have to go back to council for the full criteria to make sure we've got everything. And you've got to go back to council with a full master list of ideas, all of them. For example, some of the, I couldn't make heads or tails of all the things on the master list, and I've been doing this a while. I think pictures would help the average person. Sorry if I can get 30 more seconds. I think also you've got to think about the fact that there are things that may have been eliminated because they touch stations, okay, which sounds expensive, but it turns out that fixing our stations for future Caltrain capacity is a really big deal. The Spur report that talks about the future vision of Caltrain has all sorts of improvements that cities need to do to be able to handle more passengers. So this isn't just a grade set problem, this is a station area problem. And if we've eliminated alternatives because they touch a station and are expensive, we're looking at missing a possibility of actually getting additional funding from agencies like Caltrain, or maybe High Speed Rail, or maybe the county, because we're making stationary improvements. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Leanna Hunt, to be followed by Jeff Brown.
Good morning, members of council and public. So I've been attending these meetings pretty much from the beginning. I don't know what it's been, 8, 10 years, long time. Many council members, a number of familiar faces, and I thought it was very interesting to hear Martin's presentation, which of course is similar to what was presented way back in the beginning by Tony Carrasco and our former director of planning. Very similar concept that kind of went nowhere. I've attended because I've been attending representing the realtor community. We obviously have been very concerned that the public probably really doesn't even fathom what our corridor is going to look like with these ugly catenary wires that are going to be soon intruding on the peninsula here. I think that all of the various studies, all of the various presentations that have been made have included a whole variety of important pieces of information. I was dismayed, quite frankly. The community meetings that were held, they're very much channeled by the consultants, the so-called roundtable discussions that really stifled input, in my view. I really chose not to attend the final ones that were done because I thought this is ridiculous. No one is really enabling the public to fully vet their ideas. CARD has been outstanding. We really have to applaud these women over many years who have consistently brought forth very key pieces of information the public needed to be aware of. We don't know what will happen with high-speed rail, but I encourage you to make sure the public really has an opportunity to be heard and that they are able to access the information, improve the website. Yes.
Thank you, Leanna. Jeff Brown.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to applaud the city staff and the council for starting to make real progress on eliminating some of the options that, frankly, we've all known have been impossible all along. This process has been going on, as the previous speaker said, for 10 years, and trenching the citywide options just aren't an option in our current political environment. We don't have the funding for them, and I'm glad that they're finally being taken off the table so we can start to get real about the solutions that we have. I'd like to make a couple quick points about the criteria that have been gone into narrowing down the options. I don't think enough weight has been given to maintaining the integrity of our neighborhoods. Each of the crossings, frankly, is different. Charleston is an arterial road, and we know that we need to come up with a divided solution for Charleston. That's clear. Some of the other neighborhoods, specifically Meadow and Churchill, are not arterial. Those roads don't really go anywhere. They're spillover from intersections that were not designed properly in the first place. And I think our focus should be on improving those intersections and taking the divided crossings away from Meadow and Churchill specifically. I can't comment on Palo Alto Avenue. That one's a little more challenging. And then the last thing I'd like to leave you with, I apologize, I'm a little nervous. I didn't prepare my notes this morning. The last thing I'd like to leave you with is doing a separated crossing is permanent. If you separate a road and take away people's houses, those things can't be replaced. You can't undo a divided crossing. However, if at some point in the future we decided that we wanted to put a citywide trench in and we developed joint powers and something magical happened in the future, if we could always reopen roads that have been closed. So I'd like to make sure that people are thinking about the future when we're developing solutions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. All right, let's bring it back to members of the committee. Does anyone want to start what I know will be an interesting discussion? Any other speakers who want to speak to this item can speak at the end of the item. Yes. At the end of.
This is going to be very brief, but
all right.
If you are eliminating a twin bowl tunnel because it costs too much money, my advice to you is just be patient, okay? Bart have just announced a $12 to $15 million tunnel. Elon Musk, guys, I can do this in 1/5 of the time, 1/10 of the cost. Well, it's not really going to be quite there. But what Elon Musk is doing right now is to rediscover the true cost of twin bowl tunnels in the rest of the world. So my advice to you is be patient before you go around eliminating a twin bowl tunnel because it costs too much money. Thank you.
All right. Who would like to begin this discussion?
Adrian. I always volunteer, man, but I'll do it.
Adrian?
I'll probably need a couple rounds. So thank you all for this. This is really helpful. I think this is getting us to where we want a little bit. We had a report a few months ago, I think it was Belmont came by, and they showed similar, was it Belmont? Burlingame, that showed similar charts to this, and then also like the video flyovers. I thought that was really helpful, and I think you're going down kind of the same route. I'm sorry, and I apologize, my comments are going to be a little bit all over the place. So first of all, to Councilmember Scharf's point about why are we considering Everett here, but not in this scenario, and Loma Verde as well, it might be helpful if we kind of have a menu of a la carte things, just things that we could pull out and may be helpful but aren't directly related to this effort, and just separate those ideas out and give a brief cost estimate for them. It could be Everett, it could be Loma Verde, it could be Seal, etc. I do like the criteria, the empty dot, medium dot, full dot. I would just encourage us to use the same scale for each of them. I know you had like the check marks on some and yes, no on others. I think for consistency's sake, we may want to just stick to one set of criteria for all of these. And then also, I want to hear from my colleagues what you all think about the estimated community support criteria. I understand the going there, what we're trying to get at. I just wonder if it's kind of a circular criteria in a way. And so I have some questions there about whether that's a helpful criteria for us evaluating these options. On the TAC option, I thought that was really helpful. I was wondering, would the TAC be willing to grade each of these alternatives with all the criteria? If we asked them to, if we asked the TAC to look at each of these and say, give us what you think about safety, give us what you think about circulation, instead of just a, 1 to 3 rating?
Sure. I'll gladly answer that. First, though, I want to clarify why we use check marks and X's on some. The two with funding feasibility and constructability, those are the two fatal flaw criteria, so it's a yes or no. The other ones are more, open to interpretation. And what you see before you today, any one that had a fatal flaw is not shown in those 16 high-scoring ideas. Your second point, that's exactly what we've asked the TAC to do. We sent them this table, as well as our methodology for scoring. which was included in the packet, and we've asked them to review that and identify any issues that they see in the scoring, and also weigh in more generally on each of the ideas.
Okay, because so far we've just seen, so we're going to have a TAC opinion, which is going to be like one rating, or are they going to fill out this entire chart?
They're going to review our scoring, identify any issues that they see with the way we scored using the methodology that we provided, and then they're also going to be giving a more general opinion on each of the ideas, which we'll have to try to consolidate their opinions because there's a lot of members of the TAC.
Yeah, I understand. I guess it just might be helpful to actually see the tax opinion on each of these. So for the ped bike circulation on option PAH, what do they think, right? And have them essentially fill this out in the same way that staff has. I think if we see gaps, then we can begin to address some things. I still value the tax opinion overall. If they're giving, a thumbs up or a thumbs down on an individual alternative ID, but it might be helpful to see their rating on each of these things. And since this is our technical advisory committee, I think that might be a good role for them. Last comment before I'll hand it off, but I probably have a few more I'll respond to. I think Nadia actually put it pretty well that in the schedule, if we're saying there's 16 ideas, I think we need to keep it to 34 for the moment, and kind of focus on that and show this full matrix to council, not the 16 that have floated to the top. I guess just at a broader level, that gets to the major point is we have this menu of 34. We need to do a little bit more diligence in filling out these criteria and the boxes and explaining the weighting to folks. But I think we're getting close. I just don't think we're ready to go from 34 to 16 to 4 to 8 yet. But I'll hand off the mic to others for now.
Lydia,
In terms of what Adrian just said, I think I would like to see that you make a motion in terms of putting forth, not cutting it down to 16, keeping it at the 34, taking it to council. So if you would make the motion, I'll second it.
Let's wait a little bit, but I'm 100% there.
Greg?
So first of all, I think you guys did a really good job.
I think you did a really good job on putting this together. So it looks to me like most of the difference between the 16 and the 34 ideas was that the hybrid is always superior over the rail under the road, with the exception of a trenching, or the rail over the road. That seems to be most of the ones that did it. I think people misunderstand the role of a committee a little bit. Council doesn't do well with 34 ideas, and this is really a simple concept that, hey, when you look at this, it's really hard to argue, why would you ever do the rail under a road that's not a trench, or the rail over a road, which, why would you ever do those when they're technically don't make any sense? Now, I do agree that we should probably go to council and have council direction on, let's not move forward with the full citywide trench or a full citywide twin bore. Those, I think, should be kept in. But I'm not sure why we would go to council, which is sort of confusing. And I think it should be in the staff report, frankly. I think it should say, we started with 34 ideas, we've narrowed it down to 16 that on this list that we believe are technically feasible, but council needs to look at the citywide trench, the citywide double bore, and then there are these, there would be 18, then there's these other alternatives we have that the committee felt fell off, but obviously council could revive any of them. I think that our job here is to actually give advice to council on what needs to be done. And, council, we don't actually eliminate anything, council can bring it back. But I do think we have to say to council, we've looked at this closely, and these are the 16 that make sense. And we actually think of those 16 that make sense, that we need to make those down to 8 or 4 or whatever, and that we need to make a recommendation to council at the end of the day as a group. And that's our job. So I think that's really what I feel strongly about.
If I could, again, just to remind the committee, we're not asking for an action today. We're showing you the 16 high-scoring ideas, and Our intent is that, an easier way to get to 4 to 8 might be to go to 16 first and then 4 to 8. But ultimately, as Councilmember Scharf said, council is going to see the entire master list. And, the process that brought us from 34 to 16 to 4 to 8.
So, a couple of things I want to mention before we go to motions, and I think I do support the idea of having a motion, as Lydia was suggesting, and having it be very clear and explicit about what we want to see in next steps when it comes back, whether it's direction about going to council or direction about what we want to see at our next meeting or what we want our schedules to be. Based on a couple of things I heard from members of the public, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. I heard some people say they were concerned that we were eliminating options. I heard other people say they were glad we were eliminating options. And just to clarify, whichever side you were on that one, we're not there yet. That's not what we're doing today. We are not eliminating options today. I think each of us have our preferences about some options we want to eliminate or not eliminate, but we're not there yet. I do think that this committee should put together a recommendation, should go to council. Council should have the full list of all of the options available so they know what we were recommending against when we make our recommendation. So we can say, here's what we're suggesting we continue to explore in greater depth because these are the most appropriate, based on all the criteria, these are what we think are the most appropriate options going forward. And here are the ones that we don't think are appropriate. And then council can, of course, have the opportunity, like with any committee recommendation, to do something different. Hopefully we've got a clear enough and justified recommendation that council will be deferential to the work that we, in consultation with the community and staff and the TAC and the consultants, have come up with at that point. So I just kind of want to frame that kind of where we're at. When it comes to the specifics, I'm just going to throw out a couple of comments about how I'm feeling about some of these alternatives right now. The San Antonio Road style car overpass, I think, is a non-starter. Obviously it's one of the possibilities, but I think that that's going to be one of the ones that we're going to recommend isn't going to move forward at any of our crossings in Palo Alto. When it comes to closing roads, I think the closure or the California Avenue style closure or a San Carlos Avenue style hybrid closure where you have bike and pedestrian access but not car access at Churchill is conceivable. I think we needed to get more clarity about the circulation impacts than our existing circulation study, which I think there's a lot of concerns about. Meadow, I feel less confident about. I think that we need more clarity and understanding discussion about hybrid, berm, and viaduct, and how those can interplay, how we could transition from one to another in different places, what the visual impacts of those kinds of, especially if done in a hybrid, what those look like. Because if you have a hybrid, retaining wall and viaduct, how long of a stretch, even with the 2%, or even if 1% grade, like how far back does that have to go? How much of the city would see that? Again, with San Carlos Avenue, can you actually have that be very open and airy underneath and increase the number of bike and pedestrian routes, et cetera? So understanding the visual impact, the cost, et cetera, related to those, I think is important, and also what that means for the takings of homes. So for instance, with Meadow and Churchill, if we did a hybrid for Meadow and, not Meadow and Churchill, for Meadow and Charleston, with retaining walls and viaducts or a mix thereof, how many homes there would we need to either partially or fully take? Or would that be entirely avoidable? I'm not sure if we have that today or if that's something we could come back to. So, if you only slightly depress the road, leave the road open, are any homes or how many homes are impacted? I don't know if we have that one at hand or if that's something we could check and come back next time.
We don't have the detail that you'll want for a decision today on that.
Okay.
So for the purposes of the scoring, we assumed some property impact for the hybrids. but not as severe as, you know, road over rail or some of the other. But we're not at the point where we can give exact quantities on what property would be required for a hybrid.
And some could be partial. As you're just saying, some could be partial, right? And so I think that I think that there's a lot of interest in understanding the hybrid solutions, including at the north end of town, right here, especially if we can team up with Menlo Park. So those are just some of my thoughts about, you know, where we move forward. On the constructability, staff talked about the political framework, and I'm not clear about what that means. Does that mean the regulatory framework? Does that mean these questions about working with Caltrain and Union Pacific and the CPUC and the State Rail Master Plan? I mean, what is meant? All of the above, the city manager said.
Everybody outside of our city, actually.
Okay. All right, let's go for another round of discussion. Yeah, Greg?
So, yeah, I playing off what Corey just said, and I agree pretty much with everything you said. It would be great if you, at the next meeting, if you explained clearly what at the Palo Alto Avenue, what the hybrid looks like, what that would take with Menlo Park. You know, what would we need to do? What would that look? Any openness that you've had with their staff about it? I mean, is this something that doesn't have a fatal flaw that we can move forward on? All of that, I think that's a really positive thought on the Palo Alto Avenue one. When we get to Churchill, you know, I guess also the question of, would we leave the light there? I guess that's part of the circulation, and that if you close it so people can still turn, because I think most of the traffic there is actually to get onto Alma, because you actually can't turn left on Alma during the key issues, or are you thinking of fixing that in other ways, or how would that actually work? I think all of that matters a lot on what we do with Churchill. And then, you know, on the hybrid, I think we do on each of these hybrid things on your 16 that you've narrowed it down to here. I do think how much property would be taken, where that property would be, and what that would look like to do any of those hybrid ones. And I do think that's really important to start narrowing that down. And I do think, you know, I look at the other options that are not part of the 16 that would say they would take more property if that is true, or if they would take less property. We'd obviously want to know that. I'm assuming they take more property, frankly. But, you know, that kind of stuff, so we have that information. And then as I said on Churchill as well, I would like to see the Churchill Tunnel, you know, bike and pedestrian tunnel there as part of that. When it comes to Meadow, my big concern, obviously, with closing Meadow is traffic circulation and all of that. So I think that's something we're going to have to really address before we get into that. And then I guess deciding between, assuming we could get a 2% grade, 2% not grade, 2% grade, the Meadow plus Charleston or the Meadow Drive, obviously, I assume you'd want to do the Meadow and Charleston with the exception of cost issues. So, I mean, deciding between those two would seem purely an issue of cost, because why wouldn't you do both otherwise? And if there are reasons why you wouldn't do both, it would be sure nice to understand why. Yeah, I think those are my comments. Just flesh that out, and then I guess I need to understand a little bit about where staff wants to get to. So we started with 34. These are the 16 when we apply an initial screening that make the most sense. So far, I agree. You wanted to get this down to 4, right? Or 8. I was 4 to 8. So explain to me what 4 to 8 looks like. Is it 4? 4 would be one option for each crossing. Is that 4? And 8 is 2 options for each crossing, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so that's the goal. So basically, it would be to have this, and what it would look like is under Palo Alto Avenue, if we did 8, it would say, and then that's where that combining issue gets in, because it's like Palo Alto Avenue closed, Everett bike pedestrian, and widen University, that would be one option, right? Okay. So that could be one option. And then you could look at that and you could either decide on doing the Palo Alto Avenue hybrid or the no build. And that would be one option for that would be two options for Palo Alto Avenue, and we'd do that. Okay, so I understand that's what you're looking for us to do. So for us to start moving in that direction, I think we start to need more information regarding how we get there and the pros and cons. And I don't know how difficult it is to do some visuals, if that's really expensive. You know, the visuals you've done with those are really great. But this is what it sort of looks like. And one of the things on Churchill, for instance, if you do a bike and pedestrian underpass there, would that require taking any property, or does it not require taking property? And what does that look like? And, you know, I mean, those kind of questions. I mean, I think all of those are really, really helpful. And then when you say 4 to 8 options, 200,000 to 300,000 per option, right, to study it in depth. Okay. So, all right. Well, that's really helpful, because 8 times 3 is a lot of money. No, I mean, 8 times 3 is a lot of money. So, all right.
Mr. Chair, if I just might add some restating the overall schedule. So the idea here today was to present this concept of taking 34 ideas down towards 16. I would remind the committee, you know this, and our public too, that the staff's job is always to make recommendations. The staff doesn't vote on anything, and ultimately that's the council in your own response and listening to the community. So we have absolutely no pride of authorship or attachment to anything. We actually do think, though, that advancing some recommendations actually helps discussion as opposed to hurting it. And so the idea, though, today would be this idea of 34 to 16. We would be coming back to the committee in April sometime, where you would more specifically make your own decisions about moving to the 16 specifically. Okay, so that's not going to happen today. That was what we were envisioning would happen in April. Simultaneously in April, we're hoping to bring the award of the new consultant contract to the council. It would bring in this critically needed consultant assistance. That being said, no consultant can work on their own without the staff. I mean, it's not an either-or sort of situation. And we do have our own challenges on the staff side. I mean, we continue to lose staff in this arena for a whole host of reasons, the volume of work beyond the rail issue, everything in transportation, its impacts. And then the idea would be the council makes a recommendation to the committee makes a recommendation to the council. I think Councilmember Scharf's exactly right. The committee's role is to sort of pre-digest a lot of this information and make a recommendation to the council. We'd be going back to the council after you do this work in April for their action, and then coming back in May to the committee for you to look at how you would actually move from the 16 to this 4 to 8 concept. So there's plenty of opportunity, I mean, between now and then for us to kind of get clearer on this. I do think when we do the report, I think that what some of the comments that were made is that, you know, we report always to the council the full array of the information, 34 ideas or whatever, when we ultimately get to 16. It does seem to me to be fairly easy to start to explain why some things are being left out, and nobody is going to lose anything in the realm of transparency or public process about what happened to those ideas. And I do think it will be pretty clear as to why some of the things need to drop out. So I think we'll be in a position to sort of maintain the non-definitiveness of the recommendation for now, And, over the next month to 2 months, have a lot better opportunity for the committee and ultimately the council too, to get feedback from the public about, okay, where were we off, what needs more emphasis, and those sorts of things. So, again, we'll be back every month in the next couple of months with more detail in your action on these items.
Before we move on to kind of another round and possible motions, I had a couple of questions. One, remind me, or all of us, who's on the TAC?
So this is off the top of my head, but I'll try to think about who was at the meeting last week. Caltrain, Mountain View, Menlo Park, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, VTA, PAUSD, Stanford. Our utilities department, our planning department. I think that might capture everyone.
Who on Stanford? Is it the hospital, the university, research park, which
It's
one?
the university, their land and buildings group.
And they do all the different departments at the university?
Their
including hospital?
Their land and buildings group is typically who we interact with on planning projects. We do not have anybody from Stanford Healthcare on the TAC. The TAC is primarily a technical group that is primarily comprised of engineers and planners.
I could say when we were doing the hospital project, though, the Land and Buildings Department were leads on that land use item on behalf of as part of the hospital project. Let me say one other thing on the data visualization, just since I turned the mic on here. I'm visualizing these. Part of the effort with the new consultant is to bring the capacity on board for us to be able to do those sorts of things. That being said, just looking at the schedule we've got, it really won't be more until the May to June timeframe that we would be able to generate some of those, visuals of these alternatives. But that's our intention.
Yeah, and actually, real quick, I just had one other question, which is, I know that, I think we're going to be talking about it more over the course of the year, but could we get a little bit more clarity about what the stakeholder engagement process, separately from the TAC? There are a lot of folks in the community with great expertise and interest that staff has been working with, but could we get a little bit more, maybe a quick off-the-cuff update or clarity about what that engagement process has looked like so far and might look like going forward?
Yeah, we're in between consultants right now, so we certainly are a little short, but it'll continue to be community meetings, general community meetings, mainly for people that are sort of more new to it, to sort of Q&A and just more create awareness. What we'll do more of is more focus group type meetings. If the people that are really engaged and actually really knowledgeable and have expertise, that we're making ourselves available for longer focus group meetings with them to really get into the details of the criteria and the decision making that is happening to help inform our thinking as we come to the rail committee and to the council. And then, as Jim mentioned, we have a consultant coming on board. They have a whole community engagement expectation built into their scope of work. And so by mid-April, hopefully, we'll have that before council, which will describe the community engagement process from that time through December. So you'll hear a lot more.
So I think that is important, and I think that having, separately from the TAC, having those stakeholders meet in a focus group, maybe also on a regular basis, so that can inform the next step of recommendations from the staff, right? You can, when you're bringing your recommendations, iteratively to the committee and then to the council through us, you can say, we worked with the TAC, we worked with the stakeholder focus group, and where we've had the kind of roundtables or town hall format, community meetings as well, we can say, here's kind of what we were hearing from TAC, focus group, stakeholder focus group, community meetings, general public comments, helping inform the staff recommendations so we have better understanding of kind of the legwork you've done in outreach in addition to your own analysis and recommendation. I think that'll be helpful for us. It'll also give greater confidence to the public.
I would just like to add something that I think we want to be articulating through this whole process over this next year, and then even after we've identified a preferred alternative, there's going to be a lot of complex analysis and community process. And that is the invitation to our community to go beyond identifying questions, identifying data concerns, those sorts of things, and actually asking the expertise in our community to convert their engagement and comment into specific recommendations. They can be completely counter to what the staff is doing. But the committee and ultimately council needs the benefit of those actual recommendations. And I think we need to move into that phase where we're getting, again, more than just questions about I can't find this report or those sorts of things, to conversion of advocacy for particular kinds of approaches and recommendations. We've got to get to that, or else we're going to be, you'll be able to second guess the staff at every turn about, well, something is, one, there's a multiplicity of perspectives, and we can always be running down another answer. And I just think that, I actually think that's a disservice to our community to not expect more specific recommendations. Now, that being said, you do get those, but that's not the sole nature of what you do get. And I do think that that's what we've got to insist on.
I think that that's important as well. And kind of last thing, and then I know Greg wants to chime in as well. The question of funding feasibility is one that a lot of people have raised concerns about. I feel a little uncomfortable with how we're judging that. We did a white paper on feasibility, on funding options. Not everybody thought it was perfect. It was kind of a one-shot deal, and there's a part of me that feels like, just like we're iteratively and continuing to look back at this question of these alternatives and going through it, step by step, maybe we should be doing a similar thing when talking about funding, right? Maybe we should be continuing to say, okay, with this set, what new funding options are available, right? Or with our study several months ago, what funding options did we not consider? Or which ones that we ruled out can we say, like, or that we tentatively ruled out, can we say, yeah, we can definitely rule those funding options out because politically infeasible to have 150-story buildings through half the city or whatever. But that's just something I'm putting out there. City manager, and then
thank you,
Greg, and then I think Adrian might have a motion.
Well, so again, we expect with the consultant that we bring on board that we'll be able to put a lot more definition to the challenges and opportunities associated with different funding and financing strategies. In addition, our staff is working on our own analyses that dive deeper. So the whole question about what does a kind of payroll-based tax begin to look like? How does that work in comparison to other jurisdictions? What are the yields? What are the processes for that sort of a thing? More detailed discussion on the value capture analysis and that kind of thing. We've engaged our own financial advisor to look at what does it really mean, even to go out to the marketplace and those sorts of things. I mean, the idea of issuing debt of $2 million or more, for example, is a rarity in California at any particular point in time, and so we're going to be able to sort of provide a lot more information to the committee and then the council on these financing options. Now, I'd say one last thing. Those of you who were at finance last night, we had a separate discussion on what to be looking at potentially towards a 2018 ballot, and it was very clear that the challenges that we have for rail as it relate to funding would not be relevant viable in any way for 2018 for a whole host of reasons. I mean, you don't have projects or any of those sorts of things. And the discussion that we'd be ultimately looking at, to the extent we have to go to the voters or get any sorts of approvals that will require a vote of the people, that would be 2020 or 2022 in that horizon. So I do think we are going to have the time frame to be able to provide a lot more texture to when we talk about, is it feasible, is it not feasible, what does it mean, the politics of feasibility, let alone the financial. So.
Thanks. Greg?
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify what Jim would say in our schedule. So my understanding is this, is that we have the committee meeting today, of which we've initially looked at staff's 16, and then you're going to come back to us with another committee meeting somewhere in April.
Yeah, it
right?
says 4/18, 2018. But it now says move to early April.
That's why I
right.
said. Right, sometime in early April.
Right.
Right, at which point we will then make a recommendation to council to go with X number of, hopefully around 16.
Right.
I mean, it could be 17, could be 15, could be whatever. But we'll make a recommendation, at which point then on May 7th, we have a council date. We'll go to council, and council will then make that determination if they want to follow our recommendation, at which point they could stick with 34 alternatives, they could choose different 16 alternatives, they could do whatever they want. But we would actually have a recommendation to council on that point. And then we'll have another meeting, which will then try and narrow those 16 or whatever council has given us to look at further to 4 to 8. I would also suggest when we go to council that we get buy-in from council on the process of narrowing, i.e., we're going to go to 16 now or 15 or whatever council decides at that point, but we're going to come back to you, council, on June 4th. I'm actually not sure when
It says
it is.
June 4th is
Yeah,
the target date.
Right, we'll
now.
come back to you on roughly June 4th, at which point we will have somewhere between 4 to 8 options, which we will then spend $200,000 to $300,000 an option to go study, and that's the plan, and that will be so all of council has the buy-in to that whole process. So if that's the understanding of what we're gonna do, is that what you need a motion for, to say that's what we should do? Because I know you were planning on making a motion, so I guess that was the question. I mean, that was my understanding of what we're doing. I don't know if you need a motion to say that, but I don't, so anyway, if you need a motion to say that, I would be happy to make it. If not, you don't need it, I'm happy not to make it, or Adrian's probably,
Committee's pleasure, really.
No, so I think, Greg, you've laid it out pretty well, actually, there. I'm a bit more reassured after hearing some of this. A few more comments. So one, I think Greg is right. We have to make the scoring more explicit, that by the time this comes back to us next time, we know what the scoring are, we have the 34 ideas, they're all fleshed out across the matrix, so that when we send it to council, we can say, here's the starting list, here are the scoring criteria we used, that's why we got these 16 floating to the top. I think some members of the public were a little disappointed we only saw this completely today, so let's make this a little more concrete, bring it forward to Rail Committee, then to council for the 5-7 vote. City manager just walked out. It may be helpful to prep our council colleagues actually around this too, right? This kind of thing can actually go to our council colleagues very soon, and it may be helpful to do that before it goes in the council packet. I also agree with Chair Wolbach here that the financial comps should be included and a little more fleshed out. If we know that one idea is infeasible, let's just document it. If we think one is very feasible, let's show why that is and how that influences the criteria. And then one question, something we haven't really touched on here, one of the criteria is kind of like the station effects of these different alternatives. If we're to do a tunnel, we're gonna have to rebuild both stations. If we're doing the trench, there's potential effects, well, depending what we do at Churchill, there's dependent effects on California Avenue. Do we have any idea of how those are incorporated, like what the station effects are?
So rebuilding the stations is best captured in the funding feasibility criteria. We assumed a great deal of added costs for the ideas that would require rebuilding 2 stations.
So I hate to ask you to add another column, but it may be helpful to kind of just say what the expected station effects are for a given alternative. It could be none, it could be a total rebuild of the station, it could be that we have to extend the platform, do a berm, whatever that may be. I think that's an important consideration for 2 reasons. One is it actually is constraining some of our choices. And 2, if we're talking about, connecting Palo Alto, at least in my opinion of the city, I think the 2 stations are some of our greatest, kind of land use and urban design and connectivity opportunities we have. So that would be nice to see as well. But I just
something on that particular point.
Sure.
I was just going to emphasize that I would be a little more explicit than just to say it's a land use opportunity. That future redesigns of our stations, might be necessary, and Caltrain or other agencies, as we heard mentioned earlier, might provide funding to support that. So, as we heard, a station impact might be a financial positive or a financial negative.
Right. And then just to hammer the point home, so this is going to come back to us once more, and then at that point, you want a motion for us to say, yes, please send this to council. Then it goes to council on 5-7, and council is going to vote saying, we roughly endorse this, and we think these 16 are fair for the rail committee to go consider. And then rail committee is going to consider those 16 and recommend 4 to 8, and it goes back to council again. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. That's helpful, that's effective. Jim, I would just encourage you, as appropriate with the mayor, to begin prepping council for that 5-7 meeting. If we can begin floating this around, I think it's about time to get that going. Thank you.
So along those lines, if I could jump in, this is a little bit ahead, but we will be talking about your future meetings. If we focus on the month of April, which is the time period during which the Rail Committee will have 2 meetings on our tentative schedule yet to be calendared before the going to 16 goes to the City Council. Question of when that happens, how the socialization, so to speak, of the information that will get to Council is something we could use some feedback on. In addition, there was some suggestion that perhaps that early April meeting be an evening meeting rather than a daytime meeting, which would allow, again, more elaborate discussion of the individual, both the methodology being used to this point as well as the details of what is concluded. So your call.
So, I mean, as for an evening meeting, I'm open to that. Of course, our time should be leveraged for the council's benefit. But I think, and I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think we all roughly, think there's this list of 34. There's probably half of them which are priorities or more realizable. So I wonder how much more elaborate the discussion can get without us getting lost in the weeds. And I think, though, Ed, you have a really good question about how this should be presented to council. I'm not sure just a staff report is quite appropriate, but I'm blanking on ideas. I don't know if it's like a round table or a little charrette or whatever we do. I just think to engender buy-in and support from from our whole council, we may need something. I don't know. Maybe Greg, you have some ideas, having served for a longer time. But how we can get this list of 34 to council, get folks understanding it who have not studied this for the past couple of years. And
Well, I
then
think by
get
doing
some
it 2 steps, from going from 16 to
Right.
34. Sorry, I think by doing 2 steps, I think that's really helpful, right? I mean, it's not going to come to them with like, here are the 4 things that we think you should do. So I think that's good. I think, yeah, I think we should think about it. I think we should first of all plan on a long discussion that night. I mean, I think there shouldn't be that much else on the agenda.
Let's just call it the May meeting.
I
when the
sort of
committee's
think that's how I would do it, right? I mean, I think this should be, because we're gonna have a lot of public comment, that kind of stuff. So yeah, and I think we'll see how the first one goes, and I think the final meeting will also be a lot. You were thinking maybe of a more informal setting?
I don't know. I'm just wondering, like, will the 9 of us be able to make some decisions, even going from 34 to 16, if the other 5 members of our council haven't seen this quite as in-depth? So I know you guys are stretched and working your tails off to get this all
What
done.
might be really helpful is, when we've done it before, is that staff does some council member briefings on this stuff, or at least offers it, so to bring anyone up to speed who's feeling that they're not up to speed.
Yeah, even if it's just a download for them. I just worry, like, you know, you can see we are all having some trouble with this in terms of narrowing things down, and I don't want to get it to council and they say, oh, well, why is it these 34? And we open the telescope again.
And so, I mean, I'm guessing that that's most appropriately happens after our next meeting with the committee.
Right.
So we've, say, roughly have a month between that meeting and when it goes to the council for action. So in that interim period, we could look at some ways to engage and have a more in-depth sort of way to be sure the council's briefed. Because I do agree that just getting a staff report will not enable the whole council to hit the ground running at the meeting as well as if we did some pre-work.
We need to do some stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone want to try a motion?
I don't think we need a motion.
Can I just have one more question? On your scoring, how have you engaged the community in terms of making sure that they understand the scoring and they are participatory in terms of coming up with the scoring? How was the community engaged?
Sorry, can you ask that question again, Councilman McCoo? I was chatting with
I'm sorry,
Ed.
I can't hear you.
Can you ask that question again, please?
I said, how was the scoring? You know, you guys came up with the scoring, and some of the community members said that they just saw it yesterday. So how are you guys going to be going back out to get feedback from the community in terms of what they thought about the scoring, or is this it?
That's what we'll do. We'll be going back out. This is an initial staff scoring, first pass. We don't expect that it's right necessarily, but we want to put forward sort of our best thinking on how to apply the council criteria and do a scoring. So over the next month, we'll be meeting with the folks in the audience and beyond with a large database. We've got several people in the community that are really engaged and really knowledgeable, as you know, and we'll be bringing them in, making ourselves available to go through this in whatever detail they would like.
Right, and, okay, that's good. In terms of the schedule that we have over here, your schedule about going to council and when is all our next meetings, like one of the community members said, we should have more meetings. You know, I mean, I think this is, once a month is kind of slow, but also if you could have it scheduled when we know the community meetings are, then at least they're kind of ready and set to go. So I think it will be much more informative to everybody concerned, you know, when we're going to be having our rail committee, when we're going to be having the council meetings, as well as what kind of community meetings you're going to have. So plan it out for the rest of the year instead of coming up with it once, you know, like the March 6th one that just came up out of, well, it was planned, but let's have it more consistent so that they're aware of what's coming up and they can plan for it. You know, I had another question. Oh, the Mott McDonald study for the trenching and tunneling. So moving forward with the new consultant, are we still using that? How is the new consultants willing to take on that study or that report for the tunneling and trenching? Are they working with that, all the past reports that the Mott McDonald people were using or generated? Are they, I mean, how, most consultants, they like to have their own, right? So is this assumed that they're willing to take on the Mott McDonald studies?
Well, I think we expect our consultant to deal with the whole body of work that has been done up until now. And when we bring the consultant contract award to the council, we'll have as part of the whole report, and even if there's need to be discussion, exactly sort of what the parameter and the scope of the work that the consultant will be doing. So we'll be able to let the council know that at a council meeting.
And they're pretty much aware that we're really looking for the CSS method in terms of engaging community and looking at the process, et cetera.
Well, I think that firm that we're negotiating with is quite experienced in this realm, in the realm of, of these rail decisions, you know, in the area. So
Well, certainly we'll be engaging on our community outreach process. We're not calling it CSS, quite frankly.
Oh, I thought we were calling it. I mean, at the council meeting when we had it and there was that big discussion, it was supposedly the CSS, so it's changed along the way?
Just in terms of the scope of work for the consultants, they're basically providing technical support to the staff. So it's not I think,
So
a
it's
term
not
of art
full-
as it applies to this. Again, they're focused on getting from 4 to 8 to 1. That
see.
is their primary charge.
So it's a smaller scope then for the consultants?
Well, no, I mean, I think, I think we've had ongoing dialogue and discussion about CSS, and we've even had advocates for it who've told us to stop calling what we're doing CSS because they don't think that's what we're doing. I mean, I think the point is we have a community engagement process that is, continually being kind of adjusted and tweaked also based upon the council's recommendations. And I do think we need to acknowledge we have a core group of really informed people who actually hardly need any help at all in knowing roughly what's going on. And what we want to be sure to do, though, is engage with those folks as much as possible. And then how is it that we design the outreach for the broader community in a way that's most effective, that would be supportive of the decisions that the council is going to have to make when you move from this to at least this 4 to 8. And then I think the period from June through December, which is trying to move to a preferred option, I think we can have a lot of discussion about, in particular there, what is the engagement process that we want to use during that phase, because that's obviously going to be quite critical when you ultimately move to what is the preferred alternative. And that may be a very different order of magnitude than what we have to do at this phase right now.
So just a few comments responding there. Last year, we decided to do what we were calling a modified CSS process because if it ain't invented in Palo Alto, we're not going to use it. And so that's what we've been following. It takes some of the principles of CSS and some of the other work that we do in the city to try and get an informed decision. But I think Lydia does have a good point. We need to make the criteria crystal clear that we're using and then use them to go from 34 to 16 and 16 to 4, just so everybody has buy-in on that. I think that's a very good point she made.
So actually, I do want to make a motion. I hope it's not overly constraining, but rather just captures the things we've talked about today. So I'd like to make the motion that staff consider the following points moving forward. First, to have greater clarity about freight. 2, have greater clarity about property takings resulting from hybrid solutions. 3rd, to update the criteria. 4th, to make the scoring more explicit. 5, more clarity and discussion about viaduct, berms, and retaining walls in either hybrid or fully elevated scenarios. 6, to clarify which bike and pedestrian paths are already considered in our bike and pedestrian plan. And lastly, to consider station area impacts as positives or negatives.
Is there any way we can get those up on the screen? Or
I'm happy to repeat it and ask the city clerk to repeat. Let me just run through it one more time.
Sure.
Yeah, and this is just to ask staff to consider these points going forward.
So we've asked staff to consider a lot of things today. So I guess.
Use your mic, please.
Sorry, I guess my only concern is it would be an exclusive list, because we made a lot of comments today that I thought staff would be considering when we come back next time for a motion. I'm a little concerned that it would be an exclusive list, and I have to then think back on all the other things we said.
So let me make the motion, and then we can see if we need to amend it, either with a catch-all and other comments, or any specific item that you want to add. So it was to ask staff to consider the following points going forward. 1, greater clarity and information about freight, and I should say freight and its impacts on our alternatives. 2, property takings resulting from hybrid solutions. 3, update the criteria. 4, to make the scoring more explicit.
Was that update the criteria to make the scoring more explicit, or was it just update the criteria and make the scoring more? Which, was it 2 or 1?
Those are two separate ones. So 3 was to update the criteria.
So what do you mean by update the criteria?
Asking staff to consider doing that, right? To continue, as they, in this last period, they updated the criteria when they realized there were some things they wanted to add. If they wanted to update or provide clarity or subpoints under one of the criteria, that we would welcome, that, but also having clarity about that. 4, again, to make the scoring more explicit. 5, more clarity and discussion about viaducts, berms, and retaining walls for both hybrid and for fully elevated options. 6, let's say to separate out the bike and ped routes already envisioned. And 7, station area impacts, whether positive or negative. And I could add, and other comments made during this meeting and from the public.
So
I just wanted to have this in the action minutes, so it's easy to refer back to for staff, for the public, and for us to refer back to kind of some of the high-level stuff we identified during this meeting. That's why I wanted to put it in motion.
I think of these, I think there are 4 that are helpful, and I think there are 3 that are unhelpful. So let me go through what I think is helpful. I think a little bit of clarity on freight and which alternatives are constrained or enabled by those decisions will be helpful. I think Councilmember Wolbach makes a good point about property takings. If we can just get a magnitude for each of these, that would be helpful. Separating the bike and ped issues, as Councilmember Scharf was talking about earlier, I think would be nice. Just, it's kind of a side menu, and we know that those may be mixed and matched, but to know how much we're paying to mix and match those. And then I'm also interested in some of the station plan effects. I think the 3 that are not helpful, given the process we're going through, are updating the criteria, making the scoring more explicit, because I think that's what we've asked you to do today, and for next meeting that will be done. And then also the clarity on viaducts, berms, and retaining walls. That almost sounds to me like introducing new options on top of the 34, which I don't think at this point is helpful. So I would be willing to support clarity of freight, property takings.
So why don't you make a substitute motion? I'll support that.
All right, I'll make a substitute motion to ask staff to consider the clarity of freight issues, property takings, separation of bike and ped issues, and the station plans or effects. And these are all just general comments.
I would support that.
You want to speak to your motion?
Yeah. So, I mean, staff didn't ask us for a motion today. I think we've made a lot of comments across the board that we are beginning to narrow down the search. We need to tighten up our criteria a little bit, make some of them more explicit. But I think they get that, and it's coming back to us once more before we send it on to council with our endorsement to cut it down to 16. I think each of us has raised good issues about certain blockers or pitfalls, which could be freight, property taking, separation of bike paths, station plans. Those are a few more kind of columns we might like to be looked at. But I don't think at this point we should be introducing new criteria or introducing new alternatives. That's kind of opening the whole can of worms up again.
And just to speak to my second, I agree with everything that Adrian said. I don't actually think we necessarily need a motion today, but I think these were things that, Corey, that you called out that probably deserve special attention. And then and there were a bunch of comments today, and I think you should use your discretion to focus on all the rest of the comments. I'm not excluding those. I'm just thinking I would probably agree that those were the things that rose to the top.
And may I just add, our interpretation of the original motion and the substitute is that these are considerations you're asking us to look at as we work through this process. It's not point to point. It's not like we've got to resolve these at the next meeting or else we get a bad grade for not having dealt with them. So
You're getting a bad grade anyway.
yeah.
Don't worry
They're-
about it.
Well, that's okay.
1% or 2%?
So they're factors that you want us to be paying attention to, but, you know, I don't want Josh to drop stuff because we've gone into some detailed review on stationary issues right now, and we can't accomplish something else that we've done.
Yeah.
You're highlighting concerns you want us to be paying attention to. You're sort of preparing us in advance of the kind of questions that would be coming up at the next meeting anyway, so it's good for us to have that heads
Yeah,
up.
I think that's exactly right. So looking at this substitute motion, so it's basically, you could have, frankly, could have offered it as an amendment. I probably would have accepted it. So we're basically looking at about half of what I had originally proposed with the same intro, right, which is to ask staff to consider these points going forward, which, you know, I explicitly left out any timeline on that. So we've said repeatedly that we're not taking anything off the table, right? We got, I thought, a really interesting message this morning from Cedric, and I cannot pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to try, and I don't want to insult him by trying and failing, talking about viaducts and how they can open up a lot of opportunities for connectivity, have minimal visual impact, and can be done in ways to minimize or at least substantially reduce what are usually thought to be the major noise impacts. Doesn't mean I'm pushing for a viaduct. It means that if we are saying that we haven't taken any options off the table, but viaducts are off the table, I'm not sure how to square that.
So my understanding is that nothing is off the table, that these are 16 that staff's come forward. At the next meeting, we are going to make a recommendation to council on 16. So if anyone wants to come say you should include a different proposal than the staff's ones, that's when they should come to that meeting. And that doesn't mean it's off the table, because then it goes to council. And, you know, you can tell, if you can convince council that the rail committee, and, you know, assuming we come to a recommendation, I mean, obviously.
Right. So what my concern, though, is that a lot of things have been considered, explained, discussed. We've had an opportunity to kind of go through them and then decide, okay, these ones make sense, these ones don't. I'm worried that viaducts are one that, or a range of options around viaducts haven't really been clarified, and so it'll be difficult for us, community and staff, to make an informed recommendation to council one way or another. And again, whether it's fully elevated or just with hybrids. So I just wanted to make sure we have something out there that we want to have this discussion. That's why I wanted it in the motion, just so it's easily referenced as part of the record.
If I could add something that might put your mind at ease. Berm, viaduct, and retaining walls are construction methods for a hybrid or an elevated rail option. I think we can make it more clear in the description of the ideas that, you know, how the hybrid is constructed is still undetermined. This is just a real high-level look at the options. So, you know, a hybrid could be built with a viaduct or a berm or a retaining wall, as could a rail over road. But that's something that we're going to start to refine further down in the process as to what the construction methods are.
Okay. That puts my mind at ease quite a bit. I'll go ahead and say that I'm going to support the substitute motion. But of course, you know, if staff has recommendations for updating the criteria or clarifying the scoring, you know, I hope that the fact that it's not in the motion doesn't dissuade you from including that. Actually, before we vote, and I wanted to check with Lydia also, Adina Levin also wanted to speak. So that'll be our end of public comments for this item, and then we'll go to voting. So Adina? Oh, hit the mic button? Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks.
A really brief comment on the concept of identifying which bike ped crossings are already in the bike plan. So I think it's really helpful to indicate that, but I think it would be unhelpful if this is a possibility to actually remove them from the presentation and consideration, because people, members of the public who are looking at the spectrum of what's happening, when it's being considered that a road is being closed to vehicles, to understand how pedestrian and bicycle circulation will be preserved, either through new ideas through this process or through something that's already happening. that's important to include in that big picture. And if it's not in that big picture, people are going to come forward and go, well, how are my kids going to get across, or how am I going to get across? So I think it's important to include it in the representation in addition to, well, yes, this is already happening.
I think that's a good point, and I don't think that the motion would do that, but that's a good clarifying point. All right, anyone else want to speak on this motion? Lydia, did you want to weigh in? Anyone else? Okay, well, let's go ahead and vote. All in favor of the substitute motion? Aye. All opposed? Lydia, okay. So 3 in favor with Lydia dissenting with a no vote. And with that, let's move on. Item 3, verbal update on interagency activities.
Yes.
Anything to add?
We simply added this to your agenda. We'll do this as a standing item so that we can get updates on any relevant bodies that members of the committee or staff are attending. The one meeting that Councilmember Scharf and I did attend is the local policymaker group for Caltrain. As it happened, was canceled for March. February did have a meeting. It was exclusively focused on high-speed rail, and even then exclusively focused on what was the pending business plan that was to be released. So really no substantive update there.
And it's been released now?
It has now been released in draft form, yes.
All right.
So I have a couple
Josh?
updates too. I was going to mention the business plan. It's reprioritizing some of the segments and putting the peninsula on more of a accelerated schedule, it looks like. So we'll, be prepared to update you on the details of that if there's anything relevant at the next meeting. We did have our TAC meeting last week, and I've also gotten updates from Menlo Park and Mountain View on the progress of their grade separation projects. Mountain View is beginning preliminary design and environmental work very shortly with the goal of completing that in this coming year. And then Menlo Park is hoping to go back to their council to pick a preferred alternative for their grade separations in April.
Do you know where Sunnyvale's at?
I do not. I can get that information for you.
Just a quick question on, Mountain View is closing Castro, right? And are they doing bike ped underneath that?
So Rangsdorf, they're depressing the roadways under the rail corridor, and then Castro, they're going to close the crossing to motor vehicles and then build a bike ped underpass that connects to the other side of Central Expressway. And they're also building a ramp that will connect Evelyn up to Shoreline Boulevard. So if you're coming down Castro towards the bay, you'll be able to turn onto Evelyn and go up to Shoreline and go over on the existing
So
overpass.
they're increasing throughput on Shoreline a little bit to make up for Castro.
Yes.
And Moffett, okay.
I just basically wanted to say that when we were back in Washington DC talking to a bunch of transportation agencies as well as, different congressional groups, transportation congressional group, et cetera, it was clear that federal money for us is non-existent to zero, and that the focus is rural projects. And it was a strong emphasis on rural projects, and we're not going to qualify for a rural project. So any notion of getting lots of federal money in the next few years, things obviously changed in Washington, but at the moment it's really bleak.
Okay, and we have one public speaker on item number 3, and that is Adina Levin.
So there was a question that was raised about Sunnyvale and the direction that Sunnyvale Council was recommending that will get further study was an underpass at Mary and actually closing Sunnyvale Avenue at the tracks and having a bike and pedestrian crossing there. So a similar option to what Mountain View is moving forward with, and they already have an overpass at Matilda for the major vehicular, and so that is the direction that they are going. There's more detail that I do not remember, but that's the detail that I do.
Thank you very much. All right, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.